It was the night of November 9th, 1938, a night that came to be remembered as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Across Germany and Austria, the streets echoed with the sound of shattering windows as synagogues, shops, schools, and homes owned by Jewish families were smashed, looted, and set ablaze. This was not a spontaneous outburst of anger, but a carefully orchestrated act of terror, sanctioned by the Nazi regime, designed to humiliate, isolate, and destroy Jewish communities who had already endured years of discrimination. Over the course of hours, Jewish life that had existed in German-speaking lands for centuries was ripped apart, as thousands were arrested, dragged into the streets, beaten or sent to camps in the first wave of mass internments. Firefighters were ordered not to save burning synagogues, but to protect neighboring German property, while neighbors watched in silence or in fear. The broken glass that littered the sidewalks was not only a symbol of destroyed livelihoods, but of the shattering of any illusions that Jews could live safely under Nazi rule. Kristallnacht marked a turning point, transforming state-driven hatred into open violence and signaling the beginning of the road that would ultimately lead to the Holocaust. Tonight we will journey through every detail of this chilling moment in history, from the build-up of anti-Semitic laws and propaganda, to the organization of the pogrom, to the devastating aftermath that left a community traumatized and the world on notice. We will look at the testimonies of survivors, the role of ordinary Germans, the indifference of foreign governments, and how this night exposed the true intentions of the Nazi regime. By the time it was over, more than 250 synagogues had been destroyed, 7,000 businesses had been ruined, and the fate of European Jewry had entered its darkest chapter. This is not just a story of broken windows, but of broken lives, and of a society's descent into barbarism. As we begin this journey into the night of broken glass, I want to ask you, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it right now, as you join me to uncover the history of Kristallnacht, the night the Holocaust truly began. The year was 1933, and Germany stood on the precipice of transformation, though few could imagine the darkness that lay ahead. Adolf Hitler's appointment as Chancellor marked not only a political shift, but the opening act of a regime bent on reshaping the nation's soul. Streets once filled with debate and dissent, now echoed with marching boots and uniformed men, symbols of a new order rising swiftly. For many Germans, weary of depression, inflation, and humiliation after the Great War, the promise of national renewal seemed intoxicating. Yet beneath the rhetoric of revival, another, more sinister narrative began to take root. Hitler and his followers cast blame for Germany's suffering on a familiar scapegoat, the Jews. Propaganda machines worked tirelessly, weaving myths of betrayal, conspiracy, and corruption into everyday life. A fragile democracy collapsed into dictatorship, and with each passing week, freedoms once taken for granted slipped quietly away. In the midst of this shift, fear began to settle into the hearts of those singled out as enemies of the state. The rise of Nazism was not merely a political movement, but a cultural revolution saturating German life with symbols, slogans, and rituals that glorified unity through exclusion. Flags bearing the swastika flew from every public building, projecting a sense of permanence and inevitability. Radio broadcasts poured into homes with messages crafted to stir anger and pride in equal measure. Children in schools recited lessons that twisted history into justification for hatred. Ordinary citizens who once considered politics distant now found themselves drawn into an orchestrated spectacle of belonging. For Jews, these shifts were not yet the knock on the door or the torch in the night, but the slow erosion of safety and dignity. The words outsider and enemy began to echo in workplaces, schools, and neighborhoods. Even friendships that had lasted generations grew strained under the weight of suspicion and propaganda. This was the storm before the storm, when silence and complicity became the unwitting allies of oppression. The machinery of state power expanded with ruthless efficiency, pulling every lever of German society into its orbit. Political opponents, communists, social democrats, and dissidents of every kind were silenced in rapid succession. New laws stripped away civil liberties, eroding the fragile protections of the Weimar Constitution. Newspapers that once offered critical voices now echoed a single monotonous praise for the Führer. Police forces and secret services merged into instruments of terror, ensuring that whispers of resistance rarely grew into shouts. The image of a united, disciplined Germany became both a dream for nationalists and a nightmare for those branded as undesirable. It was within this tightening grip that anti-Semitism moved from prejudice whispered in private to policy written in law. To the regime, Jews were no longer fellow citizens but symbols of everything Germany must destroy to rise again. Fear became as pervasive as hunger had once been, and silence became the currency of survival. From the earliest months of Nazi rule, the seeds of exclusion were carefully sown. Jewish professionals, doctors, lawyers, teachers, saw their livelihoods stripped away through sudden decrees. Universities, once proud of their intellectual traditions, purged Jewish scholars in the name of racial purity. Businesses owned by Jewish families were boycotted, vandalized, and gradually forced into ruin. Every such act was cloaked in the language of legality, presenting tyranny as an orderly restructuring of society. The message was clear: Jews were no longer part of Germany's future, only remnants of a past that the regime sought to erase. For many, the shock was tempered by disbelief, a hope that these measures were temporary or would not worsen. Yet with each step, the walls closed tighter, and the line between citizen and pariah grew starker. It was not yet mass violence, but it was the calculated preparation for it. The propaganda that fueled this transformation did not rely on abstract theory alone, but on relentless repetition and spectacle. Enormous rallies filled stadiums and city squares, where Hitler's voice rose over the roar of the crowd, painting visions of destiny and doom. Films, posters, and textbooks depicted Jews not as neighbors but as dangerous caricatures to be feared and despised. The Nazi message wormed its way into the rhythms of daily life until it became nearly impossible to separate truth from fabrication. For young Germans in particular, indoctrination became identity, binding them to a cause greater than themselves. For Jews, this meant seeing their children taunted in playgrounds, excluded from classrooms, and painted as villains in stories they once cherished. The distance between communities widened with each orchestrated image and carefully chosen word. By the mid-1930s, anti-Semitism was no longer confined to fringe voices, it was the dominant language of the state. As the years passed, the tightening grip grew harsher, and the regime became bolder in its ambitions. Hitler's inner circle, men like Goebbels, Himmler, and Göring, turned policy into action, crafting a society where persecution became normalized. Jews were forbidden from holding government jobs, from marrying Aryans, from enjoying the privileges of public life. Entire professions were cleansed under the banner of racial law, while propaganda celebrated these exclusions as triumphs of renewal. To live as a Jew in Germany during these years was to wake each day to fresh humiliation and shrinking horizons. Yet many clung to the hope that their contributions to German life, their patriotism, and their shared history might shield them. These illusions, however, would be shattered by the escalating cruelty of the years ahead. The nation was being conditioned, step by step, to accept not just exclusion, but destruction. The tightening of the noose was accompanied by a strange duality, prosperity for many Germans and despair for others. The regime restored employment, rebuilt industries, and paraded achievements that distracted from the suffering inflicted on minorities. National pride swelled as unemployment fell, highways stretched across the landscape, and the military grew strong once more. For millions, this felt like redemption after the scars of Versailles and economic ruin. Yet beneath the surface, this prosperity was purchased with the currency of stolen rights, stolen livelihoods, and stolen futures. The very success of the Nazi project made resistance harder, for it cloaked persecution in the language of national triumph. In crowded cafes and bustling streets, one could see both the glow of restored confidence and the shadows of quiet fear. The storm gathered not in silence, but in the thunderous applause of a nation choosing to look away. By 1938, the transformation was nearly complete, and the boundaries of persecution had been firmly established. The Jews of Germany no longer stood as equal citizens, but as outcasts in their own homeland. Every sign, every law, every act of violence whispered or shouted that they did not belong. Yet even then, the full magnitude of what lay ahead was unimaginable to most. The nation seemed calm, orderly, and prosperous, but beneath the surface it was seething with a hatred ready to explode. Those who had once dismissed the early boycotts and humiliations now faced the undeniable truth: there was no going back. Kristallnacht was not yet upon them, but the stage had been meticulously set. The shadows had gathered, the storm had built, and Germany stood on the brink of unleashing a night that would echo across history. In the mid-1930s, Germany had been reshaped into something unrecognizable to those who remembered the open debates of the Weimar years. On the surface, life bustled with activity. Factories roared back to life, workers filled new jobs, and parades filled city squares with dazzling displays of order and power. Yet beneath this facade, a darker transformation unfolded, one that turned neighbors into enemies and everyday routines into acts of survival. For Jewish families, the world narrowed each month as new laws dictated where they could live, what they could own, and how they were seen. Cafes that once welcomed them now turned them away with signs declaring, "No Jews allowed." Friendships dissolved under the pressure of propaganda, as children whispered slurs learned at school and parents avoided social visits out of fear. Even the ordinary rhythms of life, shopping for bread, walking to synagogue, sending a child to class, became fraught with uncertainty. A society once bound by shared traditions was quietly split apart. The Nazi regime made sure that exclusion was not just policy but performance, woven into the fabric of public life. State decrees banned Jews from civil service jobs, pushed them out of universities, and barred them from professional guilds. Newspapers celebrated each removal as though Germany was being cleansed of a disease. Storefront windows shattered not just from random violence, but from orchestrated boycotts and targeted intimidation. Radios carried the venom of propaganda into every home, where voices dripped with conviction that Jews were the hidden enemy. The effect was suffocating, pressing down not only on those excluded, but also on those who watched in silence. Many Germans found relief in being part of the in-group, welcomed by the state as patriots simply for not being Jewish. Meanwhile, Jews lived in a tightening cage, their world reduced not by sudden explosion but by a steady constriction. The cruelty was not hidden, it was daily visible and normalized. Inside schools, the transformation struck with cruel efficiency. Jewish children who had once played alongside their classmates were isolated by new seating charts, special lectures, and relentless ridicule. Teachers, pressured to embody the state's ideology, singled them out as examples of inferiority. Textbooks were rewritten, not with the pursuit of knowledge, but with caricatures and lies, instructing young minds that Jews were parasites, not people. For Jewish students, the humiliation was often unbearable, and many were forced to leave school altogether. Those who remained endured loneliness that grew heavier each day, as even friends joined the chorus of mockery. The regime understood that to win the future, it needed to poison the present, seeding hatred in the hearts of children. In these classrooms, innocence was weaponized, turning learning into indoctrination. The cost was more than lost education. It was the quiet fracturing of childhoods and futures alike. In the workplaces and streets, exclusion grew more visible with each passing year. Jewish doctors who had once healed entire communities found themselves stripped of licenses and barred from treating non-Jewish patients. Lawyers lost clients as the courts themselves turned hostile, twisting justice into a tool of segregation. Shops owned by Jewish families were daubed with slogans or targeted by gangs emboldened by the state. Even in neighborhoods where trust had been built over generations, former friends now crossed the street to avoid contact. Fear of association spread like a silent contagion, as Germans worried that sympathy might be mistaken for treason. For Jews, survival meant retreating into shrinking spaces, relying more heavily on each other as society cast them aside. This transformation did not come with gunfire, but with an endless parade of restrictions that made normal life impossible. It was persecution made mundane, cruelty disguised as ordinary law. Every aspect of culture became a stage for propaganda designed to isolate and demean. Films produced by the state portrayed Jews as corrupt villains, threatening the purity of the nation. Posters hung in marketplaces caricatured them with grotesque features, urging citizens to shun and despise. Magazines published endless articles tying every social ill to the presence of Jews in the community. Even music and theatre were purged, with Jewish artists silenced and their works erased from the repertoire. In this suffocating environment, cultural memory itself was being rewritten, leaving no space for tolerance or shared humanity. The strategy was deliberate, to make hatred not an occasional eruption, but the background noise of everyday life. To walk through a German city was to walk through a maze of constant reminders that Jews were unwelcome. Each image, each word, each broadcast chipped away at the bonds of shared identity, leaving only the cold machinery of division. The impact on Jewish communities was profound, forcing people to create their own fragile networks of survival. Synagogues became more than houses of worship. They were sanctuaries for mutual support, places where dignity could still be affirmed. Families gathered in tighter circles, exchanging news, sharing scarce resources, and trying to prepare for the unknown. Underground organizations offered assistance, from secret schooling to quiet financial aid, attempting to shield their communities from complete collapse. But the constant barrage of restrictions meant even these networks were under siege, strained by the weight of fear and scarcity. Many Jews faced impossible choices to emigrate and abandon everything, or to remain and hope the storm would somehow pass. Bureaucratic obstacles, foreign indifference, and financial ruin often made escape a dream more than a reality. The cage was closing, not just with laws but with the erosion of hope itself. For ordinary Germans, the transformation of their nation was often accompanied by a troubling blend of satisfaction and silence. Many saw their Jewish neighbors vanish from public life and felt no compulsion to ask why. Some benefited directly, seizing jobs, apartments, and businesses, left behind by those pushed out. Others simply turned their eyes away, convincing themselves that these measures were necessary for national renewal. A few, with quiet courage, offered small acts of kindness, an extra loaf of bread, a word of comfort, but these gestures could not stop the overwhelming tide. The regime had succeeded in reshaping moral boundaries, persuading millions that injustice was duty and cruelty was virtue. It was not just a political transformation but a moral one, redefining what it meant to be German. In this silence, complicity became the norm, and the voices of conscience grew faint. By the late 1930s, the transformation of Germany into a nation divided by law and ideology was complete. Jews no longer occupied the same space in society as their neighbors. They had been pushed into the margins, stripped of rights, dignity, and belonging. The sense of inevitability weighed heavily, as if the state's vision had always been destined to triumph. Yet the most chilling aspect was not only the persecution itself, but the degree to which it had been normalized. Children grew up in a world where hatred was a lesson. Workers lived in a society where exclusion was law, and communities accepted violence as routine. Germany was no longer merely a nation under dictatorship. It had become a nation transformed into a weapon against its own people. And within this weapon, the fuse had already been lit for the horrors yet to come. In September 1935, beneath the theatrical banners and fanfare of a Nazi party rally, Germany codified the ideology of antisemitism into the language of law. The Nuremberg laws, introduced to cheering crowds, were presented not as radical cruelty, but as a proud moment of national renewal. Hitler framed them as necessary steps to safeguard the so-called racial purity of the German people, casting them as measures of protection rather than persecution. With these laws, centuries of prejudice found their most dangerous form, the authority of the state. Overnight, Jewish citizens became outsiders in their own homeland, redefined not by their faith or culture, but by blood. Doctors, merchants, teachers, and war veterans who had once worn German uniforms were suddenly told they did not belong. In a single stroke, identity was no longer a matter of personal choice, but of ancestry. The legal text became a weapon, precise and devastating in its effect. At the heart of the Nuremberg framework lay two central statutes, each crafted with chilling clarity: the law for the protection of German blood and German honor forbade marriage or sexual relations between Jews and so-called Aryans. The Reich citizenship law stripped Jews of citizenship, reducing them to subjects without political rights. These statutes were intentionally broad, allowing future decrees to build upon their foundation with little restraint. Civil registries, once bureaucratic tools of administration, became instruments of persecution as officials scrutinized family trees to determine who was Jewish. Individuals with even one or two Jewish grandparents were classified as Mischlinge, or mixed bloods, forced into a limbo of partial exclusion. The obsession with genealogy seeped into every corner of life, turning neighbors into informants and ancestry into a sentence. What might have seemed like words on paper carried the weight of entire futures. It was legality weaponized, with ink replacing bullets for now. For Jewish families, the impact was immediate and devastating, striking at the most intimate aspects of their lives. Couples who had built lives together across religious lines were suddenly declared illegal, their marriages invalidated, and their children stigmatized. Young lovers found their relationships criminalized, their affection branded as betrayal of the nation. Communities that had once mingled in towns and cities were abruptly severed, not by walls of stone but by barriers of law. Everyday encounters, a handshake, a business partnership, a friendship, were now shadowed by the threat of punishment. The state intruded into the private realm, dictating who could love, who could belong, and who was marked as other. For those caught in its grasp, the laws felt not only humiliating, but surreal, as if life itself had been rewritten overnight. The intimacy of human connection was no longer theirs to choose. It was dictated from above, with no appeal. The new classification system also transformed workplaces, institutions, and schools into arenas of exclusion. Jewish teachers were dismissed en masse, leaving classrooms hollow of familiar voices. Doctors who had treated generations of families were stripped of the right to practice medicine for Aryan patients. University students found themselves expelled, their futures abruptly severed by the dictates of ancestry. Even businesses that had survived earlier boycotts were crippled, as new regulations banned Jews from owning enterprises vital to the national economy. Colleagues who had once shared desks and responsibilities now faced enforced separation, with one side elevated and the other condemned. For many Germans, these changes were met not with outrage, but with quiet acceptance or opportunistic gain. Jobs vacated by Jewish professionals were quickly filled, and houses confiscated from families were reassigned to eager applicants. The machinery of exclusion created not only suffering, but also opportunity for those willing to benefit from another's dispossession. The laws seeped beyond legal decrees, becoming propaganda triumphs that reinforced the Nazi worldview. Posters and pamphlets simplified the regulations into crude diagrams, instructing citizens how to identify who was fully Jewish and who was not. Newspapers hailed the legislation as a victory for racial science, celebrating the supposed cleansing of the national body. Children in classrooms were taught to trace family lines, not to honor heritage but to root out supposed contamination. This weaponization of education ensured that the logic of the laws would be understood and internalized by even the youngest Germans. What emerged was a society where exclusion was not only enforced by police, but endorsed by culture. The lines between state and citizen blurred, as ideology permeated every conversation, every gesture, every ritual of daily life. Hatred was no longer hidden, it was celebrated as law, and law, once a shield, had become the sword. For Jews, the stripping away of citizenship carried a particularly cruel irony. Many had considered themselves proud Germans, veterans who had fought in the trenches of the First World War, patriots who had believed deeply in the country's future. Now their loyalty and sacrifice were erased with the stroke of a pen. Letters from dismissed officers and veterans reveal a quiet despair, a disbelief that the nation they had bled for had cast them aside. Elderly couples who had once displayed medals of valor in their homes now faced eviction notices. Children who had recited German anthems in schools now faced classrooms that branded them outsiders. The betrayal cut deeply, not just socially or economically, but existentially. To be told you were no longer German was not simply to lose a passport, it was to lose the very foundation of identity and belonging. The international community looked on with alarm but little action, a silence that only emboldened the regime. Foreign newspapers reported on the laws, but governments hesitated to interfere, framing the decrees as Germany's internal matters. Meanwhile, Jewish organizations worldwide issued statements of outrage and despair, but their influence could not stop the tightening grip inside the Reich. For the Nazis, this muted reaction was a green light, confirmation that their radical experiment could proceed with little fear of reprisal. Emboldened by inaction, they pushed further, using the Nuremberg framework as a template for harsher measures yet to come. For those trapped inside Germany, the message was clear: there was no rescue from abroad. Isolation was complete, and the cage was locked from both inside and out. By the late 1930s, the Nuremberg laws had done far more than segregate Jewish citizens. They had redefined the very essence of citizenship, identity, and humanity in Nazi Germany. The laws created a blueprint for the coming horrors, a scaffolding upon which the Holocaust would later be built. They stripped rights not with the chaos of mobs, but with the precision of bureaucracy, making persecution appear orderly, rational, and inevitable. In offices, clerks filed papers that decided destinies. In courtrooms, judges affirmed decisions that broke lives apart. The transformation was complete. Jews were no longer neighbors, doctors, teachers, or friends. They were subjects of exclusion, branded and bound by law. And though violence had not yet reached its full fury, the legal groundwork for catastrophe had been laid. The Nuremberg laws were not the storm itself, but the ominous rumble of thunder before it broke. The years following the Nuremberg laws saw not only the legal exclusion of Jews, but also a relentless campaign to normalize their dehumanization in everyday life. Nazi propaganda became the drumbeat that guided German society, saturating newspapers, films, posters, and radio broadcasts with messages of hate. The imagery was crude but effective, grotesque caricatures portraying Jews as parasites, corruptors, or hidden enemies within the nation. Speeches by Joseph Goebbels, master of the propaganda machine, turned public rallies into theaters of persuasion, where lies were repeated until they took root as truth. For many Germans, the sheer volume of these messages created a constant hum of hostility, hardening prejudice into certainty. What once might have seemed extreme was reframed as common sense, a patriotic duty to protect the Reich. Hatred was no longer a private prejudice whispered in corners, it was the official language of the state. The streets echoed with slogans, and silence itself became complicity. In schools, indoctrination began at the youngest levels, ensuring that children absorbed the regime's worldview before they could question it. Textbooks were rewritten to portray Jews as historical villains, responsible for Germany's defeats, economic woes, and cultural decline. Arithmetic exercises counted imaginary sums of wealth, supposedly stolen by Jewish families, while biology lessons introduced twisted concepts of racial purity. Teachers, pressured to conform or face dismissal, became instruments of ideology rather than guides of knowledge. In the Hitler Youth and League of German Girls, young people were taught to see themselves as guardians of the Aryan future, warriors in training against invisible internal threats. Songs, games, and rituals all reinforced the idea that Jewish neighbors were outsiders, dangerous and unworthy of compassion. Childhood innocence was weaponized, turned into loyalty to the Reich's brutal vision. By adolescence, many German youths no longer needed convincing, they had been shaped into believers. The power of spectacle was another weapon in this escalating campaign. Nazi rallies, choreographed with military precision, transformed hatred into communal theater. Torchlight parades, mass salutes, and orchestrated chants created a sense of unity that left little room for dissent. In these moments, antisemitism was not only preached but celebrated, woven into the very identity of the Volk. Films such as those produced by the Nazi-controlled cinema industry painted Jews as villains undermining society, reinforcing stereotypes through gripping narratives. The medium of radio, reaching millions of homes, became the voice of the regime, carrying Goebbels' venomous broadcasts into living rooms and kitchens. Families who once gathered around for news or music found themselves absorbing carefully crafted distortions designed to replace doubt with conviction. The blending of art, entertainment, and ideology blurred the lines between fact and fiction. In this environment, lies became lived reality. For many Germans, the propaganda campaign provided both explanation and scapegoat for personal hardship. Those who had struggled through the Great Depression found ready targets for their frustrations, with Jews portrayed as the cause of economic suffering. Farmers in the countryside were told that Jewish merchants cheated them, while city dwellers were warned that Jewish bankers manipulated their wages. Shopkeepers replaced old advertisements with posters declaring themselves Jew-free, not merely to comply with laws, but to demonstrate loyalty. Ordinary people found comfort in being part of something larger, convinced they were defending their nation from an insidious enemy. The effect was insidious. Hatred was dressed as protection, cruelty as duty, exclusion as patriotism. In such a climate, even those who doubted the message often remained silent, unwilling to stand apart from the chorus of voices. Silence, too, became a weapon, ensuring the propaganda went unchallenged. The campaign was not confined to words and symbols alone. It reshaped public space itself. Streets were lined with signs warning against Jewish shops, cafes, and doctors' offices, branding them as places to avoid. Posters carried phrases like "the Jew is the enemy," ensuring that hostility became unavoidable in daily routines. Local newspapers reinforced these messages, blending sensational stories of supposed Jewish crimes with fabricated evidence of conspiracies. Synagogues and Jewish cultural centers found themselves under surveillance, their activities reported with suspicion and disdain. Even architecture and monuments were reimagined to reflect Aryan ideals, further erasing the presence of Jewish contributions to German life. The physical environment became a canvas of ideology, surrounding citizens with constant reminders of exclusion. For Jews walking the streets of their own cities, the message was suffocatingly clear. They were visible, marked, and unwelcome. Inside Jewish households, the effect of this escalating hatred was felt as a growing isolation that cut deeper than legal restrictions alone. Families gathered around dinner tables, wondering who among their old friends still dared to visit, or who might now look away in the street. Parents struggled to explain to their children why classmates suddenly refused to play with them, or why teachers mocked them in front of peers. Businesses that had been built over generations found customers vanishing, not out of personal dislike, but because propaganda had made shopping there a statement of disloyalty to the Reich. Religious leaders attempted to offer comfort, but even sacred spaces felt under siege, surrounded by suspicion. The psychological toll was immense, as daily life became a relentless reminder that they were being transformed into strangers in their homeland. Fear grew not from a single act of violence, but from the steady drip of humiliation and rejection. While propaganda molded public opinion, it also emboldened extremists who took the words as license for action. Street gangs affiliated with the Nazi movement harassed Jewish families openly, smashing windows or scrawling slogans on walls without fear of punishment. Police often looked away, their silence reinforcing the message that such acts were unofficially sanctioned. Jewish youths learned to walk quickly, avoid eye contact, and stay close to safe neighborhoods, but nowhere felt truly secure. The line between legal discrimination and violent intimidation blurred, as propaganda both inspired and excused cruelty. Local officials often praised these acts as demonstrations of loyalty, further encouraging the behavior. Each broken shop window, each shouted insult, each shove on a tram became another crack in the facade of normal life. The campaign of hatred had crossed from words into lived experience, and still, it was only the beginning. By the late 1930s, anti-Semitism in Germany had ceased to be the prejudice of a radical fringe and had become the very rhythm of national life. Propaganda had achieved what laws alone could not, the internalization of hatred as culture. To oppose it was to risk being branded a traitor. To remain silent was to allow it to thrive, and to participate was to feel part of something righteous and strong. For Hitler and his regime, this escalation of hatred laid the psychological groundwork for the violence to come. The German people were not merely prepared for persecution, they had been conditioned to accept it as necessary. Step by step, word by word, the boundaries of cruelty were expanded until atrocity seemed inevitable. Kristallnacht was still ahead, but the stage had been set, the storm had been called forth, and the people had been taught to welcome its arrival. The autumn of 1938 brought a crisis that revealed how far the Nazi regime was willing to go in stripping Jews of their humanity. Nearly 17,000 Jews of Polish origin who had lived in Germany for years, some for decades, suddenly found themselves branded as unwanted aliens. Many were shopkeepers, craftsmen, and laborers who had raised families and considered Germany their home. But when the Polish government announced that passports without a special validation stamp would be invalid, the Nazis seized the opportunity to purge them. Gestapo agents and local police rounded up men, women, and children, dragging them from their homes with little warning. Families were given only minutes to gather belongings, often no more than a suitcase, before being forced onto trucks and trains. In the eyes of the state, they were no longer neighbors or colleagues, but disposable burdens. The machinery of expulsion moved quickly, with cruelty embedded in its every step. Trains rattled eastward, carrying terrified passengers, their destinations deliberately shrouded in uncertainty. The deportees were deposited along the Polish border, where German guards pushed them out at gunpoint into no man's land. Some were driven into fields, others abandoned on roads, and still others left in hastily erected camps with little food or shelter. Polish border guards, unprepared for such a sudden influx, refused entry to many, fearing a massive humanitarian burden. This left thousands stranded in limbo, neither welcomed nor allowed to return. For days, families huddled in rain and cold, living in makeshift shelters cobbled together from blankets and branches. Children cried from hunger, elders collapsed from exhaustion, and the young tried desperately to find food from nearby villages. The borderlands became a purgatory, where human suffering stretched across miles of muddy fields. The deportations had created a population of the stateless, people with nowhere to belong. Among the deportees were individuals who had spent nearly their entire lives in Germany, contributing to its society and economy, shopkeepers whose businesses had been shuttered, tailors whose customers now refused them, and factory workers dismissed without pay, all found themselves stripped of identity overnight. Their German neighbors often watched silently, some with pity, others with relief that the burden of association was being removed. For the Nazi regime, this was not only about removing Jews, but about conditioning society to accept expulsions as routine. By targeting those with tenuous citizenship, the regime tested how far it could go without provoking international outrage. The deportations became a grim rehearsal for larger expulsions and deportations yet to come. Within the suffering of those abandoned at the Polish border lay the foreshadowing of far darker policies. Their tragedy was both immediate and symbolic, an early step in the unraveling of Jewish life across Europe. The experience of the deportees themselves was a haunting tapestry of despair and resilience. Families separated during chaotic roundups struggled to reunite in the bleak borderlands, calling out names into the night. Mothers tried to shield their children from the harsh winds, using their own bodies as shelter. Fathers scavenged for food, trading valuables for bread, or begging from passing farmers. Teenagers, bewildered and humiliated, whispered questions their parents could not answer. Why had their homeland turned on them so suddenly? Every night the sounds of weeping filled the makeshift camps, mingling with the silence of despair. Yet even amid the suffering, small acts of solidarity emerged, neighbors sharing food, strangers comforting children not their own, young men organizing watch groups to protect families from theft or assault. These moments of humanity, fragile but determined, were all that kept despair from consuming the refugees entirely. The Polish government, caught off guard, attempted to stem the crisis with bureaucratic measures, but offered little relief to those already expelled. Officials debated whether to admit them, fearing both economic strain and anti-Semitic backlash within Poland itself. Many deportees were shuttled back and forth across the border, rejected by both sides, their fates determined by stamps on documents or the whims of local authorities. This cruel game of human ping-pong deepened the misery of families who had nowhere else to turn. The plight of the deportees exposed a painful truth: the vulnerability of stateless people in a world defined by national borders. With no citizenship to shield them, they became the perfect victims, stripped of both rights and recognition. Their suffering revealed how fragile the very concept of belonging could be in an age of authoritarian power and racial ideology. International reaction to the deportations was muted, foreshadowing the global silence that would later accompany even greater atrocities. Newspapers carried reports of families stranded in freezing fields, yet few governments offered practical assistance. Western powers, preoccupied with their own crises, expressed sympathy but did little to intervene. The League of Nations debated the matter but produced no meaningful resolution. For the deportees, this silence was deafening, a confirmation that their suffering was invisible beyond the barbed wire and border posts. Nazi leaders watched closely, taking note of the world's hesitation to act. In their cold calculations, the lesson was clear: they could escalate persecution without serious external consequences. The deportations thus became not only a humanitarian disaster, but also a grim signal to the Nazi hierarchy. The path toward larger and more brutal measures had been opened by the indifference of the international community. Back in German towns and cities, the expulsions sent shockwaves through Jewish communities who still clung to fragile hopes of endurance. Families who had once believed that assimilation or patriotism might protect them now saw the terrifying truth: no connection to Germany could guarantee safety. Synagogues filled with anxious prayers, while community leaders scrambled to prepare contingency plans for those who feared they might be next. Some Jews sought visas, desperate to leave before the walls closed in completely, while others tried to sell businesses and homes at ruinous prices just to have cash in hand. Fear became the rhythm of daily life, a constant shadow over every decision. The deportations shattered illusions, making it clear that Jews were not merely second-class citizens, but expendable, subject to removal at a moment's notice. The sense of betrayal was profound, for many had fought for Germany in World War I and still considered themselves loyal Germans. In retrospect, the Polish deportations of 1938 stand as a chilling prelude to the violence of Kristallnacht and the Holocaust itself. What seemed at first like a targeted expulsion was in fact a test of ideology, logistics, and public reaction. It exposed the ease with which lives could be uprooted, reduced to numbers in official reports, and discarded without mercy. For those stranded at the border, the suffering was immediate, raw, and devastating, but for the Nazi regime, it was a strategic experiment. The lessons drawn from this cruelty would shape future policies, paving the way for ghettos, deportations to camps, and industrialized murder. The plight of these Polish Jews was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a dark continuum. In their suffering, one can glimpse the outlines of what was to come: the transformation of persecution into extermination. The world had been given a warning, and it had looked away. Herschel Grynszpan was just 17 years old, a boy suspended between adolescence and manhood, when the weight of history crushed down upon his family. Born in Germany to Polish Jewish parents, he had lived much of his young life as an outsider, caught between identities that the world refused to reconcile. By 1938, he was in Paris, living in exile, surviving on the margins of a society that was itself struggling with political upheaval and anti-Semitism. His parents and siblings, however, remained in Germany, where the tightening grip of Nazi policies had already reduced Jewish life to a daily struggle. When the Polish deportation struck, Herschel's family was among the thousands expelled, stripped of their home, and left stranded in the cold purgatory of the borderlands. In Paris, Herschel received frantic letters from his family describing their ordeal, the sudden arrest, the humiliation, the hunger, the despair. The words seared into his mind, each sentence a cry of helplessness. For a young man alone in a foreign city, their suffering became unbearable to witness from afar. Herschel was not a revolutionary, nor a soldier, nor a man of politics. He was a teenager who sold newspapers, took odd jobs, and tried to navigate life in the streets of Paris. Yet, as he read his family's letters, he felt a rising storm of anger and helplessness. The world seemed indifferent to their suffering. Governments passed debates and resolutions without action, and neighbors turned away. For Herschel, the deportations were not a matter of policy, but a direct assault on his family's survival. Every word from his parents reminded him that they had become prisoners without walls, trapped in the no man's land between two nations. The thought that his mother and father were sleeping on cold ground while he walked freely in Paris gnawed at his conscience. He began to believe that only a dramatic act could break through the silence, force the world to pay attention. It was not ideology that drove him, but desperation, grief, and a sense of filial duty that left no room for restraint. On November 7th, 1938, Herschel Grynszpan carried out the act that would echo across Europe. He entered the German embassy in Paris, clutching a revolver he had acquired days earlier. Inside, he demanded to speak with an official, and fate delivered him Ernst von Rath, a junior diplomat with little influence, but the symbolic weight of the Nazi state. Herschel, trembling yet resolute, confronted him, fueled by the memory of his family's letters and the despair of his people. Moments later, 5 shots rang out in the embassy office, 2 of which struck von Rath. Herschel did not flee. Instead, he allowed himself to be arrested, almost as if his fate mattered less than the message he wanted to send. To him, this was not a crime of hatred, but an anguished cry against a world that had abandoned his family. Yet to the Nazi leadership, it was the perfect pretext. The timing, the symbolism, and the propaganda potential transformed one teenager's desperation into a weapon for mass persecution. As von Rath lay dying in a Paris hospital, Nazi propagandists seized upon the event with ruthless efficiency. Joseph Goebbels, the regime's chief orchestrator of lies, immediately framed the shooting not as an isolated act, but as evidence of an international Jewish conspiracy. Newspapers across Germany plastered headlines about the attack, describing it as part of a worldwide plot against the Reich. Radio broadcasts fanned the flames, warning ordinary Germans that Jews everywhere were plotting to destroy their nation. The truth that a desperate boy had lashed out over his family's suffering was replaced by a narrative of treachery and menace. Nazi officials knew the propaganda value of the incident was immeasurable. They now had a ready-made justification for the violence they had long prepared to unleash. In their hands, Herschel's act of desperation became the spark to ignite a pogrom already waiting for fuel. Meanwhile, in Paris, Herschel sat in a French jail cell, his emotions swinging between despair and grim resolve. He had accomplished what he set out to do. The world was paying attention, though not in the way he had hoped. International reporters flocked to the story, some portraying him as a misguided youth, others as a symbol of resistance against Nazi brutality. The French government, caught between the diplomatic outrage of Germany and domestic debates about justice, struggled with how to handle him. Herschel himself explained his motives clearly. He could not stand idly by while his family suffered. For him the act was personal, not political, but history rarely respects such distinctions. As he sat in his cell, He could not have foreseen the tidal wave of destruction his act would unleash across Germany. What he viewed as a cry of anguish would soon be remembered as the trigger for one of the darkest nights in modern history. Back in Germany, the regime carefully staged its response, waiting for the opportune moment. When von Rath died on November 9th, the Nazis declared him a martyr, the victim of what they called Jewish aggression. Goebbels delivered a fiery speech to party officials in Munich, insinuating that spontaneous action against Jews would be understandable, even desirable. Across the Reich, stormtroopers, SS men, and loyal party members received the unspoken order, unleash violence. The connection between Herschel's act and the wave of destruction that followed was not accidental, but orchestrated. For ordinary Jews in Germany, the news of von Rath's death spread dread through their communities. They feared reprisals but could not imagine the scale of the brutality about to descend upon them. Herschel's bullet had been fired in Paris, but its echoes were about to shatter windows, burn synagogues, and spill blood across Germany and Austria. The story of Herschel Grynszpan is filled with tragic irony. He sought to act on behalf of his family, to strike back at a regime that had humiliated and destroyed their lives. Yet, instead of weakening the Nazis, his desperate act gave them the excuse they long desired to escalate their persecution. Herschel could not have predicted that the pogrom, known as Kristallnacht, would follow in the days after his action. His family, already suffering in exile, would now witness an even greater wave of violence against their people. The Nazis would twist his story into a tale of villainy, erasing his humanity and painting him as the embodiment of Jewish malice. His gunshot in Paris became a symbol, but its meaning was stolen and reshaped by those in power. For Herschel, the tragedy was doubled. His act neither saved his family nor spared his people from suffering. Instead, it became the spark that ignited a firestorm. Looking back, Herschel Grynszpan's story remains one of the most poignant episodes leading to Kristallnacht. It reveals how the desperation of a single individual could be manipulated into a justification for mass violence. It also highlights the cruel efficiency of Nazi propaganda, which could turn tragedy into opportunity with chilling speed. Herschel's act was born of love for his family, of anguish for their suffering, but it was swept into the larger machinery of hate. His youth, his isolation, and his despair were overshadowed by the colossal forces of ideology and state power. For historians and survivors alike, his name is remembered not for the life he lived, but for the catastrophe that followed his desperate act. In the vast narrative of the Holocaust, his story underscores the way personal pain could be weaponized into collective persecution. One boy's cry for justice became the prelude to a night of shattered glass, fire, and death. In the quiet halls of the German embassy in Paris, November 7th, 1938, began like any other day of diplomatic routine. Clerks handled correspondence, telephones rang with the chatter of international politics, and junior diplomats busied themselves with the endless bureaucracy of the Reich abroad. Among them was Ernst von Rath, a 29-year-old official from a respected family, dutiful but far from influential in the larger Nazi hierarchy. Von Rath had no idea that by the afternoon his name would be known across the world. Into this atmosphere walked Herschel Grynszpan, a thin, nervous teenager carrying a revolver in his coat. Grynszpan's mind burned with anguish over his family stranded on the Polish border, victims of the mass expulsions that had left thousands homeless. When he asked to speak with a German diplomat, fate placed von Rath in his path. Within moments their worlds collided, and 5 shots echoed through the embassy corridors, forever altering the course of history. The attack was sudden, shocking, and chaotic, leaving von Rath gravely wounded on the embassy floor. Colleagues rushed to his aid, dragging him to safety as the sound of gunfire sent ripples of fear through the building. Outside, Parisian police quickly apprehended Grynszpan, who did not resist, his face pale yet strangely calm as he confessed to the act. In custody, he explained that he could no longer endure the suffering inflicted upon his family and his people. For him, the shooting was not an act of hatred toward one man, but a desperate outcry against the machinery of persecution. Yet the simplicity of his motive would soon be swallowed by the storm of propaganda. The Reich seized the event with ruthless speed, stripping away its human tragedy and reframing it as an attack on Germany itself. For von Rath, still clinging to life, his name became entangled in a drama that was already being written far beyond his control. As von Rath lay in a Paris hospital, doctors fought to save him, but his condition worsened with each passing hour. Newspapers in France reported the shooting, framing it as the tragic act of a desperate youth, while Jewish and refugee communities braced for reprisals. In Germany, however, the story took on an entirely different tone. Goebbels and the Nazi propaganda machine described the attack not as personal but as political, portraying Grynszpan as the instrument of an international Jewish conspiracy. Every headline, every broadcast amplified the message. Jews had declared war on the Reich. Ordinary Germans who read their morning papers or listened to the radio were told this was proof of Jewish treachery, a plot that reached into the very heart of their nation's embassies. The facts of Paris were irrelevant. The narrative crafted in Berlin was what mattered. The stage was being set for vengeance disguised as justice. For von Rath, the ordeal became both personal tragedy and political theatre. As he lingered between life and death, the Nazi leadership elevated him to the role of martyr. His personal life, complex and private, was erased by the regime in favor of a simplified tale of loyalty and sacrifice. Goebbels emphasized his youth, his service to the Reich, and his supposed embodiment of German values. At his bedside, German officials posed for photographs, sending images back to Berlin that portrayed unity, strength, and righteous indignation. The dying man, barely able to speak, had become a symbol, transformed into a vessel for the hatred and fury of an entire state. When he finally succumbed to his wounds on November 9th, the Nazi leadership declared his death not just the loss of a diplomat, but a direct assault upon the honor of the German nation. Goebbels immediately recognized the propaganda potential and acted with decisive cruelty. In speeches, he presented von Rath's death as the final straw, the moment when Germany could no longer tolerate what he framed as Jewish aggression. He insinuated that retaliation would not only be justified but expected. To Nazi officials and party members gathered in Munich for the anniversary of Hitler's failed putsch, the message was clear: unleash the violence that had long been simmering beneath the surface. In reality, preparations for widespread pogroms were already in motion. Grynszpan's act had simply provided the excuse, with von Rath's blood as their rallying cry. The Nazis would soon ignite one of the darkest nights in German history. His funeral, draped in flags and orchestrated with grim precision, became both spectacle and warning. His death had been turned into the spark to light a nationwide firestorm. In Paris, Herschel Grynszpan awaited his trial, unaware of the scale of destruction his act would unleash. He insisted repeatedly that his motive had been personal, born of anguish for his parents and siblings stranded in destitution. Yet no defense he could offer would matter once the Nazi propaganda machine had reshaped the narrative. To the world, he became a symbol, either a misguided youth striking at oppression, or, in Nazi eyes, the embodiment of Jewish conspiracy. International newspapers debated his act. but none could predict that his bullet would trigger a pogrom of unprecedented ferocity. Herschel's despair had been genuine, but it was now overshadowed by a tidal wave of orchestrated hatred. The world would remember his name, not for his family's suffering, but for the inferno that followed in Germany's streets. The shooting of Ernst von Rath also revealed the Nazi regime's mastery of narrative manipulation. Goebbels did not create the anger, he redirected it, harnessing genuine shock into a weapon against an already marginalized community. In doing so, he demonstrated the terrifying power of propaganda, where a single event could be twisted into justification for nationwide violence. Germans who might otherwise have dismissed the attack as an isolated tragedy were now told it was proof of a Jewish declaration of war. Every synagogue, every Jewish-owned shop, every family living in fear would soon feel the weight of this deception. The propaganda transformed von Rath from an obscure diplomat into the banner under which destruction would be unleashed. By November 9th, the question was not whether violence would come, but how far it would go. The irony of the moment is haunting. Herschel Grynszpan had acted out of desperation for his family, yet his act became the justification for their community's torment. Ernst von Rath, a man with no direct role in anti-Jewish policy, became the symbol of retribution, and Joseph Goebbels, seizing the narrative, turned a tragedy into a planned catastrophe. In those days between the shooting and von Rath's death, history balanced on the edge of manipulation and truth. When the propagandist prevailed, the result was Kristallnacht, a night where windows shattered, synagogues burned, and countless lives were destroyed. The shooting in Paris had become the prelude to a pogrom, its sound echoing far beyond the embassy walls. It was proof that in Nazi Germany, every event could be twisted into fuel for hatred, and every death could become a weapon for the regime's darkest ambitions. In the days following Ernst von Rath's shooting, the Nazi leadership began preparing for a response that would appear spontaneous, but was in reality meticulously organized. Behind closed doors, Joseph Goebbels seized control of the narrative, framing the incident as the latest chapter in what he described as Jewish aggression against Germany. Hitler, at first cautious, allowed his propaganda minister to unleash fury under the guise of popular outrage. Nazi officials, SA leaders, and Gestapo officers quietly received instructions the time had come to strike. The idea was not to quell violence, but to direct it, giving it the appearance of a natural eruption of national anger. In truth, every broken window and every burning synagogue would be the result of orders drafted in advance. The regime wanted the world to see chaos, but it was chaos carefully choreographed by the state. Goebbels' speech on November 9th, delivered in Munich during the anniversary of the beer hall putsch, was the signal. With Hitler present but silent, Goebbels electrified the audience of senior Nazis and regional leaders, speaking in tones of fiery indignation. He painted von Rath as a martyr, killed by an international Jewish conspiracy, and claimed Germany's patience had finally run out. His words were carefully chosen, not as direct commands, but as a license for violence. Those in attendance understood immediately what was expected, and phone calls soon buzzed across Germany, transmitting coded instructions to local party officials. Demonstrations, they were told, should erupt immediately, with police ordered not to interfere. The illusion of spontaneity masked the truth. This was an operation coordinated from the highest levels of power. The stage for Kristallnacht had been set. Local Nazi leaders moved quickly, ensuring the pogrom unfolded with both precision and ferocity. Lists of Jewish businesses, homes, and synagogues had already been compiled by the Gestapo long before the shooting in Paris. Stormtroopers and Hitler Youth units were mobilized, their leaders briefed to destroy property, but avoid looting for personal gain, ensuring the violence appeared disciplined rather than chaotic. Fire brigades were given orders not to extinguish burning synagogues unless German-owned property was endangered. Police were instructed to stand aside, to watch and record, but never to protect the victims. Ordinary Germans would later claim the violence looked like mob rage, but in reality, the mobs had been assembled, instructed, and unleashed with ruthless efficiency. Behind every torch, every hammer, every shouted slogan was the quiet hand of the state. The propaganda apparatus ensured that the violence appeared both inevitable and justified. Newspapers printed headlines of Jewish conspiracies, amplifying Goebbels' narrative that the Reich was under attack. Radio broadcasts stoked anger by highlighting von Rath's death as a national tragedy. In homes across Germany, families listened to these broadcasts, some uneasy but many convinced that the coming fury was righteous. For those already steeped in years of antisemitic indoctrination, the leap from resentment to violence required little encouragement. Posters and slogans reinforced the sense of collective duty, framing attacks on Jewish property as acts of patriotic defense. Even those who never lifted a hand were drawn into the theater of consent, standing silently as windows shattered and fires spread. The power of the regime lay not only in those who acted, but in the millions who allowed it to happen. At the heart of the orchestration was the deliberate use of terror disguised as national expression. The Nazi leadership understood that mass violence served not only to punish the Jewish community, but also to bind ordinary Germans to the regime's brutality. By labeling the pogrom, spontaneous responsibility could be blurred, leaving perpetrators with the illusion of acting on instinct rather than orders. Victims were made to feel abandoned, realizing that the state itself was orchestrating their destruction. In this way, Kristallnacht became not just a night of shattered glass, but a demonstration of absolute power. It showed that in Hitler's Reich, legality and law enforcement could be twisted into tools of persecution. Terror was no longer hidden in back rooms or camps. It now paraded openly in the streets. In cities, towns, and villages, the choreography of violence unfolded with frightening uniformity. Synagogues were torched almost simultaneously, their flames lighting up night skies from Berlin to Vienna. Jewish-owned stores were smashed with methodical precision, shards of glass littering the streets like the fragments of a broken society. Families were dragged from their homes, sometimes beaten, sometimes arrested, while their neighbors watched in silence or quiet approval. The speed of the destruction was striking, as if every step had been rehearsed. Police reports filed later betrayed the truth. The so-called riots had been managed down to the smallest detail. Nothing about Kristallnacht was random. It was an operation of state terror disguised as outrage, a test of both the regime's machinery and the public's willingness to accept open persecution. The illusion of spontaneity also provided the Nazis with plausible deniability on the international stage. German diplomats abroad insisted the riots were uncontrolled eruptions of popular anger. They claimed the government had tried to calm the population but could not restrain their grief and fury. In reality, the same government had issued the orders, mobilized the mobs, and ensured the violence was carried out with systematic efficiency. Foreign journalists saw through much of the deception, but the sheer scale of destruction left them stunned. Behind the rhetoric of outrage lay the cold calculation of terror as policy. The Nazi state had not only sanctioned violence, but had staged it as theater, its actors drawn from every arm of the regime. By the end of those orchestrated nights, the line between propaganda and reality had blurred beyond recognition. The people of Germany had witnessed what seemed like uncontrolled mob violence, but in truth they had watched the state bare its teeth. For Jews, the message was unmistakable. There was no refuge in law, no safety in silence, no protection from neighbors or officials. For ordinary Germans, the pogrom demonstrated the cost of dissent and the rewards of complicity. And for the Nazi leadership, Kristallnacht confirmed that a society could be mobilized through lies, hatred, and fear into tolerating even greater crimes. The spontaneous outrage had been anything but. It was a rehearsal for genocide, carefully prepared, meticulously executed, and devastating in its implications. The night of November 9th, 1938, began like any other across German cities, but beneath the surface a storm had been carefully prepared. As darkness fell, orders spread quietly through Nazi networks, delivered to party offices, SA units, and Hitler Youth commanders. At first, streets were calm, with civilians returning from work and shops closing for the evening. Yet by late evening, strange movements began, groups of young men gathering, police patrols stepping back rather than forward, fire brigades waiting idly by. It was the eerie calm before a night of orchestrated terror, where destruction was disguised as spontaneous fury. As clocks ticked toward midnight, the illusion of normalcy shattered with the first crashes of glass. Across cities, the pogrom erupted with terrifying coordination. What followed was not chaos, but a deliberate performance of brutality, staged in the streets of the Reich. In Berlin, the first flames lit the skyline as synagogues were set ablaze under watchful eyes. Firefighters arrived swiftly, not to extinguish the sacred buildings, but to ensure the flames did not spread to non-Jewish property nearby. The Great Synagogue on Fasanenstrasse, once a symbol of Jewish presence in Germany's capital, burned against the night sky, its walls collapsing as crowds gathered to watch. SA men in uniform hurled furniture, Torah scrolls, and sacred texts into the fire, laughing as centuries of culture were reduced to ash. Residents looked on from apartment windows, some aghast, others whispering approval, and many simply silent. The crackle of burning wood mixed with the jeers of the mob, creating an atmosphere both carnival-like and terrifying. For the Jewish community, it was a nightmare made real, their houses of worship transformed into bonfires of hatred. Farther south, in Munich, Vienna, and countless towns, the same scenes unfolded with uncanny simultaneity. Mobs armed with hammers and iron bars descended on Jewish-owned shops, smashing windows with rhythmic precision. Display cases that once held clothing, jewelry, or books were reduced to heaps of glass shards glinting under the streetlights. The sound of shattering panes gave the pogrom its enduring name, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Shopkeepers who dared protest were shoved aside, beaten, or dragged into the streets. Some neighbors who had long frequented these stores now stood and watched silently, unwilling to intervene. Others, emboldened by years of propaganda, cheered the destruction as a cleansing of the nation. The violence carried an air of inevitability, as though the state itself had sanctioned the mob's every swing. Inside Jewish homes, terror spread even faster than the flames outside. Families huddled in fear as SA men banged on doors, smashing locks and storming into bedrooms and kitchens. Men were beaten in front of their wives and children. Women screamed as possessions were hurled through windows, and elderly residents were dragged from their beds. Children cried as the walls of their world seemed to collapse with every boot and fist. In some towns, Jewish residents were forced to march barefoot in the streets. While mobs jeered, the violence was not limited to property. It targeted dignity, safety, and identity. Each blow delivered a message that Jews had no place in the Reich, not in their homes, not in their businesses, not even in their synagogues. For many, the destruction that night was a cruel prelude to something even darker. The role of the police and authorities revealed the machinery behind the violence. Officers stood by as shops were ransacked, intervening only to ensure that looters did not steal merchandise for themselves. Fire brigades worked efficiently, but not to protect synagogues. They only doused fires when German-owned property risked damage. Government offices compiled reports, recording the destruction with bureaucratic detachment, as if it were a weather event rather than a state-organized pogrom. Some police commanders even assisted in arrests, rounding up Jewish men under the guise of preventive custody. For Jews seeking help, the betrayal was devastating. The very institutions meant to safeguard order had turned against them. It was not mob violence in the usual sense. It was terror with official permission, written into the silence of those who could have stopped it. For ordinary Germans, the night brought a spectrum of responses, each carrying its own weight of complicity. Some joined in the violence, swinging hammers and shouting slogans, intoxicated by the sanctioned frenzy. Others watched from doorways or windows, their silence as powerful as the blows struck by the perpetrators. A few were horrified, whispering prayers or pulling Jewish neighbors indoors to hide them, but such acts were rare and dangerous. Many more rationalized what they saw, convincing themselves it was beyond their control, or even that the Jews had somehow brought it upon themselves. Propaganda had done its work, shaping perception so thoroughly that atrocity appeared almost ordinary. In the morning, people would walk past shattered storefronts and burned synagogues, shaking their heads but returning quickly to their routines. The violence had been both extraordinary and terrifyingly normalized. As the hours passed, the destruction spread like wildfire across the Reich and annexed Austria. Synagogues that had stood for centuries were reduced to smoldering ruins, their stones blackened, and their sacred texts charred. Cemeteries were desecrated, gravestones toppled, and Jewish schools destroyed. Thousands of Jewish-owned businesses lay in ruins, their shop fronts gutted and interiors vandalized. The scale of destruction was staggering, and yet the violence was eerily uniform, reflecting careful planning rather than genuine spontaneity. By dawn, streets were carpeted in shards of glass, giving cities an appearance both glittering and grotesque. The broken glass became not just a description of property damage, but a symbol of a shattered community, broken faith, and fractured future. What began as an orchestrated demonstration had become one of the darkest nights in Germany's history. For the Jewish community, November 9th into November 10th was a night of fear, humiliation, and despair. Families emerging from hiding found their synagogues gone, their shops destroyed, and their sense of security obliterated. Thousands of Jewish men were arrested, dragged into prisons, or sent to concentration camps under brutal conditions. For them, Kristallnacht was not merely the destruction of property, but the beginning of a descent into systematic persecution that would culminate in genocide. The night revealed to every Jewish family that survival in Germany was no longer a matter of perseverance or hope. It was now a matter of escape, if escape was even possible. For the wider world, the pogrom sent a chilling signal. The persecution of Jews was no longer hidden in policy or law, but unleashed in the streets for all to see. It was the opening act of terror that would soon engulf all of Europe. The flames began in the dead of night, curling upward into the black November sky, painting towns and cities with an ominous glow. Synagogues that had stood for centuries, some older than the German nation itself, were consumed in orchestrated infernos. In Cologne, the great synagogue lit the horizon like a burning monument, its spire collapsing as bells rang in alarm, but not for salvation. Fire brigades arrived promptly, yet their hoses remained dry, directed only at protecting nearby non-Jewish buildings. Within hours, what had been sanctuaries of faith learning, and community were reduced to skeletal walls and smoking ruins. From Berlin to Vienna, from Hamburg to Munich, the story was the same: fire replacing prayer, ash replacing history. The destruction was so synchronized, so total, that it could only have been born of state orders, carried out with chilling efficiency. The sight of sacred structures crumbling into dust struck terror into the hearts of Jews who watched helplessly from the shadows. For them it was the burning away not just of buildings, but of their very place in the nation. Inside the synagogues, the devastation was even more profound, for it was not only wood and stone that perished. Torah scrolls, carefully written and preserved through generations, were dragged out and hurled into the flames. Prayer books, each worn with years of devotion, were scattered across the floor before being trampled or ignited. Cantorial robes, menorahs, and sacred ornaments were ripped apart, desecrated as symbols of a culture declared unwelcome. The destruction was not random. It was meant to erase memory, to strip Jews of their identity by annihilating the physical vessels of their faith. In one city, a witness described the chilling silence of the scrolls burning, the crackle of parchment indistinguishable from the sound of wood collapsing. For congregants, these objects were more than artifacts. They were threads binding generations to their ancestors. Watching them vanish in smoke felt like a severing of history itself, a violence that extended beyond the material into the spiritual. The fires were not contained to grand synagogues alone, but reached into every corner of Jewish life. Small prayer houses, tucked into back streets of villages, were smashed apart by mobs before torches set them ablaze. In towns where Jewish communities had lived side by side with neighbors for centuries, the familiar sound of morning prayers was silenced overnight. In rural areas where synagogues doubled as schools and community centers, the destruction carried a double weight: children's classrooms reduced to ash, study halls gutted by fire. The smell of smoke lingered for days, a grim reminder to survivors that their community had been erased from the map. Even in places where the fires could not consume, vandalism left interiors in ruins, pews shattered, walls defaced, and sacred spaces desecrated beyond recognition. In every city, the message was unmistakable: there was no refuge, no corner safe from the reach of hatred. The emotional impact on Jewish communities cannot be overstated. Families gathered in silence, watching their spiritual homes collapse, unable to intervene as the mobs jeered and cheered. Children clung to parents, asking why their temples were burning, questions that no parent could answer without trembling. Elderly men and women wept openly, seeing the destruction of places where they had been married, prayed, and buried loved ones. For many, these synagogues were not simply religious centers, but symbols of continuity, proof that despite centuries of persecution, Jewish life had endured. Now, in one coordinated night, that endurance seemed to vanish into embers. Survivors later described a feeling of spiritual homelessness, as though they had been stripped not just of property, but of belonging. It was an attack on memory, on identity, and on the intangible essence of community itself. From the perspective of the perpetrators, the burning of synagogues was framed as an act of purification. Goebbels and other Nazi leaders had long painted Jewish faith as a contaminant within German culture. And now fire was used as a ritual of cleansing. Crowds gathered in some places, clapping as flames reached higher, their faces lit with the glow of destruction. Nazi officials spoke of the fires as if they were natural events, a spontaneous reflection of the people's will, when in reality they were carefully staged. For the SA men who swung torches and axes, the night was a performance of loyalty, a test of obedience to ideology. Many took pride in destroying structures they had passed daily, viewing it as proof of their devotion to the Reich. Yet beneath the orchestrated rage lay a chilling truth. The destruction of synagogues was a rehearsal for something far larger, a signal of how far the regime was willing to go. Outside Germany, reports of the fires spread rapidly, shocking communities abroad. Newspapers carried photographs of blackened ruins and described the eerie sight of burning temples in Europe's great cities. To the outside world, the destruction of synagogues symbolized a descent into barbarism, a state-sanctioned attack not only on a religion but on civilization itself. Diplomats lodged protests, church leaders expressed outrage, and yet concrete actions were few. For Jews within Germany, the realization was crushing. If the world's sympathy could not stop the burning of synagogues, it would not save them from what came next. International voices condemned. But the Reich calculated correctly that no army would march, no sanction would stop their campaign. The flames were both a warning to the Jewish people and a signal to the world. The Nazi regime would destroy without restraint, and resistance would bring no rescue. The morning after the fires, the physical aftermath, resembled the ruins of war. Streets were littered with ash and debris, blackened frames of synagogues, rising like skeletal monuments to hatred. Communities walked past their destroyed sanctuaries in silence, unable to comprehend the scale of loss. Jewish men were already being rounded up and arrested, while women and children stood helpless before the ruins. The air still reeked of smoke, a smell that seemed to cling to clothing, hair, and memory. In some neighborhoods, neighbors avoided eye contact, ashamed or complicit, while others pointed with cruel satisfaction at the wreckage. For Jews walking past the remains of their temples felt like attending funerals without coffins, mourning not just buildings but centuries of life and faith. The destruction was not temporary, it was irreversible, tearing holes in the cultural fabric of every city touched by the flames. The burning of synagogues during Kristallnacht marked more than destruction. It was a signal that a threshold had been crossed. What had once been persecution through law, propaganda, and social exclusion now became persecution through open violence and cultural annihilation. By erasing sacred spaces, the regime sought to erase identity itself, sending the unmistakable message that Jews had no future in the Reich. The fires were both literal and symbolic, literal in the destruction of physical structures, symbolic in the destruction of hope. For survivors, the sight of their temples reduced to ash became a haunting memory, a moment when centuries of endurance seemed undone in a single night. In the years to come, those ashes would become a grim marker of the path that led from exclusion to extermination. Kristallnacht's flames were not isolated. They were the first great firestorm of a genocide yet to come. The morning light on November 10th, 1938, revealed streets that looked like the aftermath of a battle, though no war had been declared. Shop fronts once lined with Jewish-owned businesses now stood as hollow shells, their windows shattered into glittering carpets of broken glass. Furniture, merchandise, and personal belongings lay scattered across cobblestones, looted by those who had taken advantage of chaos. Store signs bearing Jewish names were ripped down, trampled, or smeared with crude slogans that mocked the victims. In major cities like Berlin, Munich, and Vienna, entire commercial districts were transformed into ruins overnight. Police and fire brigades, present in uniform, did not intervene but stood idle, ensuring only that flames did not spread to non-Jewish property. Passers-by navigated the wreckage with a mix of indifference, curiosity, and in some cases cruel satisfaction. For Jewish business owners who returned to their storefronts, the devastation was not only financial but existential, a destruction of lifetimes of work and heritage. The shards of glass reflected more than light. They reflected the breaking of trust, of belonging, of security itself. Inside Jewish homes, The terror had been even more intimate. Doors were kicked open in the middle of the night as mobs stormed in, smashing furniture, tearing apart photographs, and overturning tables where families had gathered only hours before. Bedrooms were ransacked, children's toys broken, cupboards emptied of food and valuables. Families huddled together in corners, listening to the jeers of intruders who turned their private lives into public humiliations. In many cases, men were dragged from their beds and beaten in front of their wives and children, leaving both physical scars and memories that would never heal. Women tried desperately to protect their homes, clinging to belongings, only to be shoved aside as invaders wielded clubs, knives, and fists. The violence was as much psychological as physical, designed to instill fear so deep it would last for generations. By dawn, many Jewish households were unrecognizable, stripped bare, with walls marked by vandalism, and silence replacing what had once been the warmth of family life. These homes were not random targets, they were chosen symbols, reminders that no place was safe. On the streets, the terror unfolded like a grim spectacle. Mobs, composed of Nazi stormtroopers, Hitler youth, and emboldened civilians, moved from block to block with an air of grim determination. Shop windows exploded under hammers and rifle butts, their sharp cracks echoing like gunfire through otherwise quiet neighborhoods. Goods were thrown into the streets, clothes, shoes, typewriters, even pianos, while onlookers laughed or scrambled to steal what they could. In towns where Jews had lived peacefully for centuries, neighbors joined in or turned their faces away, complicit in silence. Children watched, some laughing, as they tossed stones into already broken windows, learning through destruction what the regime had taught them to believe. To many participants, the violence felt sanctioned, even encouraged, a test of loyalty to the Reich. For victims stumbling through the streets amidst shards and smoke, it felt like a world collapsing in plain sight. Every smashed window was not only a material loss, but also a public declaration that Jews were no longer part of the community. The violence was systematic, not spontaneous. Orders had spread down the chain of command, ensuring that police forces did nothing to stop the destruction. Insurance companies were instructed not to compensate Jewish business owners, turning economic ruin into a weapon of policy. Local Nazi officials compiled lists of Jewish shops and homes, directing mobs with chilling precision. The destruction was not random chaos, but an engineered humiliation, an economic assault paired with physical terror. In cities like Leipzig, entire Jewish business districts vanished overnight, leaving owners destitute and vulnerable. In Vienna, looters smashed into cultural institutions, tearing apart libraries and desecrating art collections. Every act of vandalism carried the weight of official approval, reinforced by propaganda that painted Jews as deserving of punishment. The regime had transformed civilian streets into battlegrounds, where the weapons were not tanks or rifles but torches, clubs, and bureaucratic decrees. It was a reminder that terror could be imposed not only through armies but through ordinary streets, made into instruments of state violence. Amidst the destruction, individuals endured moments of unimaginable terror. Survivors recalled crouching behind broken furniture as attackers roared with laughter while wrecking family heirlooms. Children cried as their toys were smashed, learning too young that hatred could reach even into the smallest corners of innocence. A young woman in Frankfurt remembered her mother clutching a wedding photograph as intruders ripped it from her hands and tore it apart. In Vienna, shopkeepers returned to their premises to find not only destruction, but mocking graffiti scrawled across walls. For some, the humiliation was worse than the material loss, for it was designed to break dignity, to destroy not just property, but identity. Men arrested in the streets were dragged past their shattered businesses, forced to witness the ruins of their lives before being hauled to trucks bound for camps. These stories echo with the cruelty of a system that ensured no one could feel safe, not in their shops, not in their homes, not even in their own neighborhoods. Each memory carried forward a truth. Kristallnacht was not just violence, it was psychological warfare. The atmosphere of the streets changed forever in the aftermath. Where once Jewish shopkeepers had greeted customers and children had played outside, now silence and absence dominated. The broken windows were quickly cleared. The debris swept away, but the emptiness remained. Many Jewish businesses never reopened, their owners imprisoned or too frightened to return. For neighbors, the absence of familiar faces became a haunting reminder of complicity, though few dared to speak of it. For others, the sight of cleared streets was used as propaganda proof of a cleansing celebrated as progress under the Nazi regime. The very act of repairing streets, while leaving Jewish families ruined, emphasized the indifference of a state that valued appearances over humanity. Ordinary citizens who walked those streets in the days after carried the weight of the violence, whether they acknowledged it or not. The glass had been swept, but its echoes lingered in the silence of shuttered shops and the hollow gaze of survivors. The psychological scars extended beyond Jewish communities. For those who had participated, whether as looters, bystanders, or attackers, the night normalized brutality as a form of civic duty. For children in the Hitler Youth, smashing windows and humiliating neighbors became a formative experience, binding them more tightly to the Nazi cause. For those who had done nothing, silence became complicity, shaping a culture where cruelty could thrive without opposition. German society had been transformed, the streets of terror serving as both a warning and a rehearsal for greater horrors to come. It showed that the right could mobilize an entire nation into acts of violence under the guise of spontaneity. The normalization of terror in everyday neighborhoods laid the groundwork for the machinery of genocide. If a Jewish shop could be smashed with no consequences, so too could Jewish lives be destroyed with no remorse. Kristallnacht was the crossing of a threshold, and the streets themselves had become the stage for it. Looking back, the shattered streets of Kristallnacht symbolized more than broken glass. They symbolized the breaking of a people's security, dignity, and hope. The destruction was not simply vandalism. It was a state-mandated announcement that Jewish life in Germany had no future. Families walked those streets knowing they were marked, isolated, and abandoned by the society they once called home. Each glittering shard reflected both fear and forewarning, a silent prophecy of what awaited in the years ahead. For survivors, the memory of those streets never faded, etched into their minds as clearly as any scar. To walk through a city where everything familiar had been destroyed overnight was to realize that nothing would ever be the same. The night had turned ordinary neighborhoods into arenas of terror, where humanity itself seemed to vanish. The streets of terror were not merely a moment in history, they were the opening act in a tragedy that would engulf millions. Kristallnacht's broken glass was the first splinter of a shattering yet to come. The violence of Kristallnacht was not confined to broken glass and burning synagogues. It spilled into the very bodies of its victims. Across German cities and towns, Jewish men and women were dragged from their homes and subjected to savage beatings in the streets. Crowds gathered as stormtroopers kicked, punched, and struck their targets with clubs, the humiliation magnified by public spectacle. Elderly men were singled out for their vulnerability, their frailty mocked as they were thrown to the ground. In some cases, children were beaten before their parents' eyes, the cruelty designed to sear itself into memory. Hospitals filled with the wounded, though many were turned away by doctors under pressure to deny care. Neighbors who might once have offered help now stood silently at windows, unwilling or afraid to intervene. In the span of hours, familiar streets became arenas of sanctioned barbarity. For many Jews, the violence stripped away the last illusions of safety, leaving only fear and despair. Murders occurred with chilling frequency, carried out with both brutality and casual indifference. Victims were beaten to death in their own homes, their cries drowned by the cheers and laughter of mobs. In some cases, men were shot in the streets, their bodies left as warnings to the rest of the community. Women were assaulted in front of their children, their dignity destroyed alongside their sense of security. In rural towns, attacks were often even more savage, lacking the thin veil of discipline seen in larger cities. Some perpetrators acted with cold calculation, while others appeared swept up in the frenzy, striking again and again as though violence were liberation. The dead were rarely mourned publicly, their funerals restricted, their names whispered only in private. For families who survived, the absence of their loved ones became an unspoken wound that deepened with each passing day. The murders of Kristallnacht were not random. They were warnings, each life taken a signal that survival itself had become precarious. The cruelty often targeted symbols of respect and identity, ensuring the pain extended beyond physical harm. Rabbis were singled out, dragged from their homes in their prayer shawls, mocked as they were paraded before jeering crowds. Professionals, doctors, lawyers, teachers were beaten with particular venom, their social status transformed into an excuse for hatred. In one city, a rabbi was forced to stand in the ruins of his synagogue as assailants struck him, laughing at the destruction around him. In another, a school teacher was beaten in front of his students, the regime ensuring that young minds learned contempt from violence. Families watched as the pillars of their community were humiliated, their authority reduced to bleeding wounds. The brutality carried an unmistakable message: no title, no age, no reputation could shield them. Each attack was as much a performance as a crime, meant to show that power lay in destruction, not in tradition or learning. The tearing down of leaders paralleled the tearing down of walls, leaving Jewish society fractured and exposed. The terror seeped into every corner of family life. Children woke to the sound of boots crashing through doors, their toys crushed beneath the feet of intruders. Mothers tried desperately to shield their little ones, only to be shoved aside or struck themselves. Fathers, often powerless, were forced to watch as their families were brutalized, the impotence cutting deeper than any blow. In some cases, attackers taunted families by forcing them to witness the destruction of their possessions before turning violence on their bodies. The sight of fathers bloodied and broken before their children was calculated to destroy generational stability. For many children, Kristallnacht became a defining memory, a night when their innocence vanished forever. Families that had lived together in warmth and tradition now lived under the shadow of trauma. Even in survival, the scars would remain, shaping how they viewed the world and how the world had betrayed them. The night shattered not only windows, but also the bonds of trust that held family life together. The violence was not confined to urban centers. It spread across the Reich, from small villages to provincial towns. In remote areas where Jewish families were fewer in number, the attacks were often even more isolating and terrifying. A family in a rural village might wake to find the only synagogue in the region reduced to rubble, their home next. With no neighbors to hide among, their exposure was total, the sense of vulnerability unbearable. In small communities, the betrayal by familiar faces cut the deepest. Farmers who had once traded goods with Jewish shopkeepers now turned away, or worse, joined in the attacks. The murders and beatings in these areas carried an extra cruelty. for they destroyed not just lives but the very idea of belonging. No Jewish family, whether in Berlin or in a remote hamlet, could believe themselves safe after that night. The reach of violence had been total, its spread deliberate, leaving no corner untouched by fear. The brutality also served as a rehearsal for more systematic forms of persecution. Those who carried out the beatings were often members of the SA or SS, using Kristallnacht as an opportunity to test how far terror could go in plain view. The lack of punishment reinforced the lesson that Jews could be attacked without consequence. Police officers who had sworn to protect citizens instead turned away, documenting events as though they were routine. The indifference of authority transformed violence into policy, brutality into governance. For perpetrators, the night blurred the line between mob action and official command. For victims, the realization was devastating. The state itself was their enemy, the law itself their executioner. Kristallnacht was both a climax of hatred and a preview of what was to come. The beatings and murders that filled its hours foreshadowed the industrial scale of killing that would later unfold. In every strike of a club, in every body left bleeding in the street, the future could already be seen. Yet, amidst the terror, moments of desperate humanity flickered, fragile but real. Some neighbors, though powerless to stop the violence, whispered warnings or opened doors in the dead of night. A few Christian priests condemned the brutality from their pulpits, though most remained silent. Isolated German citizens, horrified by what they witnessed, tried to help the wounded or offered food to families left destitute. Their actions, though rare, revealed that compassion had not been entirely extinguished, but these flickers of decency were overwhelmed by the roar of state-sanctioned hatred. For every act of kindness, there were countless acts of cruelty, reminding victims that mercy was the exception, not the rule. The brutality of Kristallnacht had reshaped the boundaries of morality, teaching millions that violence against Jews was not only tolerated, but expected. Even those who did nothing carried the weight of silence, their inaction complicit in the suffering. For Jewish families, the message was unmistakable. Survival would require endurance beyond measure. In the aftermath, survivors of the beatings and murders carried both visible and invisible scars. Broken bones healed slowly, but the memory of boots and fists never faded. Families mourned those killed in the night, forced to bury their dead quickly and without dignity. Children grew up haunted by the images of their parents' humiliation, their trust in humanity fractured. The brutality of Kristallnacht marked a turning point, transforming persecution into violence so raw that the next step seemed inevitable. For the Nazi regime, it was proof that society would accept, even embrace, murder as policy. For the Jewish community, it was the end of illusions, the end of safety, and the beginning of a nightmare without end. Kristallnacht had not only destroyed businesses and synagogues, it had attacked the very bodies and souls of its victims. The beatings and murders ensured that the night would never be forgotten, etched into history as the threshold of genocide. The streets that ran red with blood that night foreshadowed the rivers of suffering yet to come. The morning after Kristallnacht did not bring calm, but instead a new phase of terror carefully orchestrated by the Nazi regime. Across Germany and Austria, Jewish men were targeted in mass arrests, torn from their families under the pretense of restoring order. Police officers and SS units arrived at homes and businesses, carrying lists of names compiled well before the pogrom. Fathers were dragged from beds in front of their children, given little time to dress, and forced onto trucks waiting in the streets. The arrests were not random. They were systematic, designed to dismantle communities by seizing their leaders and breadwinners. Some families begged for explanations, but silence and brutality were the only replies they received. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as the roundups unfolded, some relieved not to be targeted, others quietly horrified. For Jewish families, the uncertainty was suffocating, not knowing where their loved ones were being taken or if they would return. The arrests turned Kristallnacht from a night of terror into the beginning of mass imprisonment. The numbers were staggering. Over 30,000 Jewish men were seized in just days, an unprecedented escalation in Nazi persecution. Police wagons and military trucks filled with prisoners rumbled through city streets, while others were forced to march through neighborhoods humiliated and jeered by bystanders. In Berlin, long columns of men shuffled past shops and offices, their heads bowed against the scorn of onlookers. In smaller towns, the sight was no less jarring, entire male populations disappearing overnight. The speed and coordination of the arrests revealed that Kristallnacht had not been chaos but policy, carefully designed to escalate the destruction of Jewish life. Families left behind were plunged into crisis, with women and children now bearing the burden of survival alone. The arrests also served as a warning. Jewish life in Germany could now be dismantled, not just through exclusion, but through mass incarceration. The scale of the operation sent a chilling message to the entire Jewish population. The state had moved from harassment to imprisonment on an industrial scale. Those arrested soon discovered the true horror awaiting them at concentration camps like Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. Transported by train or truck, the men were crammed into overcrowded compartments, deprived of food and water, and subjected to beatings along the way. Upon arrival, the brutality intensified as guards with snarling dogs forced the prisoners through gates marked with slogans promising false order. Stripped of belongings and dignity, the men were herded into barracks designed to break both body and spirit. Roll calls in freezing conditions lasted for hours, with those collapsing beaten mercilessly. Prisoners were shaved, issued thin uniforms, and immediately subjected to grueling labor regardless of their age or health. Those who resisted or faltered were punished with solitary confinement or worse. The camps were not yet extermination centers, but they were already instruments of systematic cruelty and degradation. For many of the men taken after Kristallnacht, the camps were their first taste of a machinery that would soon expand into genocide. The conditions inside the camps were deliberately crafted to crush individuality and instill despair. Food was scarce, little more than watery soup and stale bread, insufficient for men forced into hard labor. Disease spread quickly in the cold, damp barracks, claiming lives even before punishment or exhaustion could. Guards tormented prisoners with arbitrary orders, forcing them to perform pointless tasks for their amusement. One day men might be ordered to move heavy stones from one end of the yard to the other, only to repeat the process in reverse the next day. Religious Jews were mocked for their faith, some forced to eat pork or desecrate prayer items under the threat of violence. Even in the face of constant humiliation, small acts of resistance emerged, men whispering prayers, sharing crumbs of bread, or supporting the weak during marches. Yet survival was far from guaranteed, and many never returned from the ordeal. For families outside, the silence of absence grew heavier with each passing day. For the Nazi regime, these mass deportations served multiple purposes beyond raw cruelty. They demonstrated the efficiency of the state, showing that Jewish populations could be uprooted and controlled with terrifying speed. They terrorized families into submission, ensuring that any thoughts of resistance would be clouded by fear of imprisonment. They also tested public reaction, gauging how ordinary Germans would respond to the sight of their Jewish neighbors being taken away en masse. The lack of significant protest emboldened the regime, confirming that society would not rise in defense of its Jewish citizens. By targeting men specifically, the Nazis destabilized families, leaving women and children without providers, protectors, or voices in the public sphere. The arrests also stripped Jewish communities of leaders, professionals, and businessmen, accelerating the collapse of economic and cultural life. Each truck that carried men to the camps was not only a convoy of prisoners, but also a symbol of Nazi control tightening across the Reich. The deportations also had a devastating psychological impact that reached beyond those taken. For the men imprisoned, the camps were nightmares of violence and uncertainty. For those left behind, the waiting was its own form of torture. Wives spent sleepless nights fearing for husbands, mothers for sons, daughters for fathers. Children asked questions that could not be answered, their innocence shattered by the sudden emptiness of absence. Many families tried to send letters or parcels, though most never reached their loved ones or were returned unopened. Rumors spread of starvation, disease, and executions, compounding the dread of silence. Families often sold possessions to survive, clinging to the hope that one day their men would return. The arrests tore holes not only in households, but in the very fabric of Jewish community life. Each absence became a reminder of vulnerability, each disappearance a warning of what might come next. For some of the men, release did eventually come, but only after weeks or months of torment. Those fortunate enough to survive were often broken physically and emotionally, their faces gaunt and their spirits hollowed by what they had endured. Many were released only under the condition that they would soon emigrate, their imprisonment serving as a brutal push to force Jews out of the Reich. Families reunited in relief, but also in fear, for the men who returned were shadows of themselves. They spoke little of what they had witnessed, often too traumatized to share the details. Their silence, however, spoke volumes, warning others of the cruelty the camps contained. For the Nazi state, this was part of the design, releasing survivors as walking testaments of fear. Every man who stumbled back through his door was proof that the system had the power to destroy, and that it could do so again. The terror of the camps thus extended far beyond their fences. The mass arrests and deportations following Kristallnacht marked a turning point, transforming persecution into a campaign of incarceration. No longer confined to laws or propaganda, antisemitism had manifested in mass imprisonment backed by the full authority of the state. The beating hearts of families had been torn away, leaving communities hollowed and weakened. The concentration camps, once tools of political repression, had now become central to the Nazi project of controlling and terrorizing Jews. Kristallnacht's shattered glass had signaled the end of illusions. The arrests that followed made clear that survival itself was now at stake. For the men who suffered in Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen, the nightmare was both an ordeal and a warning of darker times to come. For their families, each empty chair at the table was a reminder that their lives had changed forever. In the shadows of those deportations lay the blueprint for genocide, and though many hoped it was the peak of violence, history would show it was only the beginning. On the night of November 9th, 1938, when windows shattered and flames consumed synagogues, ordinary Germans stood as silent witnesses to state-sponsored terror. Some peered from their windows as mobs stormed Jewish homes, their expressions unreadable, caught between curiosity and quiet fear. A few even laughed or cheered, treating the destruction as spectacle rather than atrocity. Others looked away deliberately, closing shutters or turning up radios to avoid the sounds of breaking glass and terrified cries. The indifference of the many provided cover for the brutality of the few, creating an atmosphere where silence equaled consent. Fear of reprisal from the Gestapo certainly played a role, yet fear alone cannot explain the wide absence of protest. Decades of propaganda had prepared the ground, teaching Germans to view Jews as outsiders, their suffering as inconsequential. When the streets filled with shards of glass and smoke, most citizens did not see neighbors in peril, but rather targets already marked as different. Complicity did not always require action. It often thrived in passivity. The role of the police during Kristallnacht revealed the collapse of institutions meant to safeguard society. Across German cities, officers did not intervene to stop rioters, but instead directed traffic away from burning synagogues. Reports from the time described policemen calmly observing mobs as they looted businesses, stepping in only to prevent theft by non-Nazi opportunists. Some joined in the beatings and arrests, dragging Jewish men into custody while leaving arsonists unbothered. The presence of uniformed authority lent the violence an air of legitimacy, signaling to onlookers that the events were sanctioned by the state. Even those officers who harbored private doubts obeyed orders, unwilling or unable to oppose the machinery of power. By standing aside, the police transformed from guardians of law into enforcers of racial persecution. The streets of Germany, once governed by law, became open stages for destruction. Inaction in this context was as powerful as participation. The fire brigades played their part in this grim choreography of complicity. Called to scenes where synagogues blazed, they did not douse the flames, but carefully contained them to protect neighboring Aryan property. Sacred scrolls, wooden pews, and centuries-old structures burned unchecked while firemen stood idly by, hoses aimed only at preventing the spread of fire beyond Jewish walls. In some cases, firefighters even ensured that flames fully consumed synagogues, leaving nothing behind but rubble and ash. Their selective efforts symbolized the regime's priorities. German heritage mattered. Jewish heritage did not. Neighbors watching the glow of destruction in the night sky saw uniformed men in helmets, lending quiet approval through inaction. For Jewish communities, the sight of fire brigades refusing to save their sacred spaces deepened the sense of abandonment. The institutions that once symbolized protection had now been twisted into tools of exclusion. Even water, the universal extinguisher, had been denied to them. For many ordinary Germans, the events of Kristallnacht blurred the lines between coercion and enthusiasm. Some looted willingly, carting off furniture, clothes, or valuables from shattered shops, as though it were a holiday market. Others remained at home, relieved that the violence was not directed at them, whispering half-hearted objections only behind closed doors. Fear was real. Denouncing the pogrom openly risked arrest, but apathy and opportunism were equally potent forces. Many had absorbed years of anti-Semitic rhetoric that dulled compassion and encouraged rationalization. A smashed shop window might be shrugged off as inevitable punishment for people already portrayed as enemies of the state. Crowds gathered to watch without intervening, their presence lending silent approval to the destruction. The line between passive observer and active participant became perilously thin that night. For those targeted, there was no distinction. The silence of neighbors was as cutting as the stones hurled through their windows. The complicity extended to the workplace and institutions of daily life. In schools, teachers the next morning explained the pogrom as a response to provocation, reinforcing the narrative that Jews had brought violence upon themselves. Civil servants processed reports of arrests and property seizures without protest, stamping papers that legalized theft and imprisonment. In offices, colleagues noted the absence of Jewish co-workers with indifference or whispered relief that another desk was now available. Railway employees transported prisoners to concentration camps, performing their duties without asking questions about their destinations. Bureaucracy became a silent accomplice, smoothing the machinery of persecution with rubber stamps and signatures. In this way, complicity was not limited to streets or mobs, but extended to the quiet rhythms of daily administration. Violence was normalized not only in shattered glass, but in the ordinary paperwork of a nation obeying orders. Yet not all Germans celebrated or ignored the violence. Some recoiled in quiet horror. Diaries and letters from the time reveal individuals disturbed by the sight of broken shops and desecrated synagogues. A few even tried to intervene, though their efforts were quickly shut down by Nazi officials. Isolated voices condemned the brutality in hushed tones, fearing the knock on the door that followed dissent. Some neighbors offered comfort to Jewish families, providing food or shelter in the aftermath, small acts of decency amid widespread cruelty. But such gestures, while courageous, were rare and often hidden from public view. The overwhelming narrative of Kristallnacht remained one of conformity and silence. Even those who felt shame often did nothing, trapped between personal morality and state power. The small sparks of empathy, though present, were drowned out by the flood of indifference. For Jewish survivors of Kristallnacht, the complicity of their neighbors was perhaps the deepest wound of all. Many had lived side by side with non-Jewish Germans for generations, sharing schools, workplaces, and friendships. To see familiar faces watching silently, or worse, jeering as synagogues burned, was a betrayal beyond words. Trust evaporated overnight, replaced by the realization that they stood utterly alone. Children who once played with neighborhood friends were now shunned, their families treated as outcasts in places they had called home for centuries. The violence of Kristallnacht was devastating, but the silence of neighbors was equally crushing. It revealed that the social fabric had been torn, and that Jewish belonging in German society had been erased. The complicity of the nation confirmed what propaganda had long preached. Jews were now outsiders, abandoned in the land of their birth. In the aftermath, the role of civilians, police, and fire brigades in Kristallnacht became a chilling testament to the power of complicity. The pogrom was not just an eruption of Nazi violence, but a national event shaped by silence, opportunism, and quiet obedience. State institutions that once promised protection revealed themselves as instruments of exclusion. Ordinary citizens, whether through fear, indifference, or greed, allowed terror to unfold unchecked. The shattered glass and burned synagogues told not only of Nazi cruelty, but also of a society that had surrendered its conscience. Kristallnacht was therefore more than a night of destruction. It was a mirror reflecting the choices of a nation. In those choices, whether to act, to ignore, or to participate, the path toward the Holocaust was paved. Complicity had become collective, and in its silence, a nation gave its assent to persecution. News of Kristallnacht traveled swiftly across borders, carried in newspapers, radio reports, and diplomatic cables. Journalists described streets strewn with glass, synagogues engulfed in flames, and Jewish families dragged from their homes in the dead of night. The foreign press published harrowing accounts, photographs of smoldering ruins, and testimonies from refugees who managed to escape. Headlines across Europe and America screamed of a barbarity that had shocked even seasoned observers of Nazi Germany. In coffeehouses of Paris, London, and New York, people whispered about the pogrom as a terrifying glimpse of what Hitler's Germany had truly become. Yet the outrage, though powerful in words, rarely translated into concrete measures. Public sympathy for the Jews of Germany clashed with the political caution of governments, still wary of conflict with Berlin. It was a moment when global awareness met global hesitation. The world had seen the fire, but its response was a whisper rather than a roar. In London, the British press condemned the violence in scathing editorials, denouncing it as savagery unbecoming of any modern nation. Politicians voiced outrage in Parliament, yet official government action remained limited to diplomatic protests. Britain still carried the scars of the Great War, and was reluctant to provoke Germany into open confrontation. There were debates about easing immigration restrictions for Jewish refugees, but quotas and domestic resistance made real change slow. Public opinion in Britain was sympathetic, but the fear of being overwhelmed by foreign arrivals tempered compassion with caution. Behind closed doors, officials weighed humanitarian responsibility against national interests, often choosing the latter. A handful of visas were issued, yet the floodgates remained firmly shut. For Jews trapped in Germany, Britain's sympathy offered little sanctuary. The contradiction between moral outrage and political restraint left a lasting impression of missed opportunity. In the United States, newspapers ran front-page stories on the shattered synagogues and mass arrests. Radio broadcasts carried emotional commentaries describing Kristallnacht as a night of shame for Germany. Public figures and church leaders condemned the pogrom in strong terms, appealing to American values of justice and freedom. Yet within the government, isolationism and anti-immigrant sentiment dictated policy. President Roosevelt recalled the U.S. ambassador from Berlin in protest, but immigration quotas for German Jews remained unchanged. The Depression had left millions unemployed, and many Americans resisted opening doors to new arrivals. In towns and cities across the nation, sympathy was heartfelt but often powerless, constrained by law and politics. Jewish organizations lobbied tirelessly for expanded refugee programs, but their pleas were largely ignored. America's response was symbolic, not structural, a nation voicing outrage, but unwilling to absorb the human cost. For German Jews, it was another signal that the world was watching but not acting. Across continental Europe, the reactions varied, but the theme of caution remained constant. France condemned the violence through diplomatic channels, but hesitated to loosen its already strict refugee policies. Switzerland, overwhelmed with those fleeing Germany, tightened its borders to prevent an unmanageable influx. Smaller nations expressed sympathy, but lacked the resources or will to intervene meaningfully. In Eastern Europe, where anti-Semitism was already entrenched, Kristallnacht elicited less shock and more uneasy recognition. Some governments quietly hoped the persecution would divert Jewish migration away from their borders. The lack of a unified European response reinforced Germany's sense that it could act with impunity. For Jewish communities across the continent, the message was chilling. If such violence could occur openly, and Europe would not intervene, then no place could truly be considered safe. The pogrom had international observers, but no international saviors. Beyond governments, ordinary people around the world reacted with a mixture of horror and helplessness. Synagogues in London and New York held vigils, their congregations praying for those caught in the firestorm. Students marched in protest in several European capitals, carrying placards demanding justice for Germany's Jews. Letters to newspapers poured in, filled with anger, grief, and appeals for action. Yet this grassroots outrage lacked the power to shift entrenched policies. Politicians, mindful of voters anxious about refugees and economic burdens, often resisted humanitarian appeals. Even as individuals lit candles or sent donations, the broader machinery of asylum remained stalled. For Jewish communities abroad, Kristallnacht was both a tragedy and a warning that time was running out. The gap between public sympathy and governmental inaction revealed the world's paralysis. The night's shattered glass was visible everywhere, yet it failed to break open the doors of sanctuary. The Vatican, too, expressed quiet condemnation, though carefully couched in diplomatic language. Church leaders lamented the desecration of houses of worship and the persecution of believers, while avoiding direct confrontation with Hitler's regime. Individual priests and bishops condemned the pogrom more openly, but the broader church treaded carefully to avoid escalation. Some Christian groups in the West rallied in support of Jewish victims, recognizing the assault as an attack on faith itself. Yet institutional caution muted the impact of religious outrage, leaving symbolic gestures where bold statements might have been. In Germany, church leaders remained largely silent, fearing reprisals that would further erode their autonomy. The absence of a unified moral voice from Europe's most powerful religious institution deepened the sense of abandonment. For many Jews, this silence became a bitter memory, a reminder of how fear and politics could outweigh compassion. The Vatican's muted tone reflected the world's wider hesitation. Nazi leaders carefully observed the international reaction, analyzing every word of outrage for signs of real threat. When they saw only protests, editorials, and withdrawn ambassadors, they concluded that the pogrom carried no serious consequences. Hitler and Goebbels interpreted the world's restraint as tacit acceptance, emboldening them to push their policies further. Kristallnacht, meant as both punishment and test, confirmed that Germany could escalate persecution without external interference. The silence of armies and the inaction of governments signaled to the Nazis that they had a free hand within their borders. For Jews still in Germany, this realization was devastating, stripping away hope that foreign powers might intervene. Each smashed window now represented not only German hatred, but also international indifference. The Reich understood that words were powerless without deeds, and they would exploit that knowledge ruthlessly. The pogrom had been a dress rehearsal, and the world had failed to interrupt the performance. In the months following Kristallnacht, the limits of international sympathy became undeniable. Refugee conferences and diplomatic debates yielded little change, leaving tens of thousands still trapped inside Germany. The image of burning synagogues and shattered glass faded from headlines, replaced by other crises on the horizon. Governments that had once expressed outrage quietly returned to their policies of restriction and caution. For German Jews, the realization was stark: no outside rescue was coming, and the walls of their world were closing in. Kristallnacht had revealed the brutality of the Nazi regime, but it also exposed the hesitancy of the global community. The night was remembered not only for its violence, but also for the silence that followed it. In shattered glass, the world had glimpsed its own moral reflection, and too often it chose to look away. The pogrom was both a crime and a test, and the world tragically had failed it. The morning after Kristallnacht, Jewish families who emerged from their homes saw not only the ruins of their shops and synagogues, but also the beginning of a new phase of persecution. Shards of broken glass glistened in the streets, but behind them lay wrecked livelihoods, stores gutted, businesses looted, and workshops burned. For generations, Jewish entrepreneurs, craftsmen, and merchants had woven themselves into the fabric of German commerce. Now, overnight, their ability to survive economically was deliberately torn apart. The regime declared with cold precision that the Jews themselves would pay for the damage inflicted upon them. An enormous fine was levied, not against the perpetrators, but against the very victims of the violence. This injustice struck like a second blow, ensuring that recovery was impossible. It was not chaos alone, but a calculated economic strangulation. The Nazi government imposed a collective fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks on Germany's Jewish population. To many Jews, the number seemed unfathomable, exceeding their capacity to imagine, let alone pay. Wealthy families were stripped of assets, while the poor faced a burden that condemned them to starvation and ruin. Banks froze Jewish accounts, and even the smallest reserves of savings were drained into state coffers. Property, businesses, and insurance payouts were systematically confiscated by the Reich. If a shop had been destroyed by fire, the insurance claim did not go to its owner, it went to the state, What had been built over centuries of labor and tradition was dismantled in a matter of weeks. The financial blow completed what fire and fists had begun. This was not only robbery, it was erasure by ledger and decree. Businesses that had survived the physical attacks were quickly stripped away through legal decrees. The Nazi leadership ordered the forced Aryanization of Jewish enterprises, transferring ownership to non-Jewish Germans at fractions of their value. Shop signs once bearing Jewish names were taken down, replaced by eager German buyers who acquired them for pennies. Families who had worked their entire lives to build small stores or factories found their legacy stolen overnight. In many cases, employees or neighbors became the new owners, beneficiaries of state-orchestrated theft. The dispossession was presented as an economic adjustment, but its true purpose was annihilation through bureaucracy. What violence had broken, paperwork sealed. For Jewish families, the loss was not only financial, it was the destruction of dignity and the theft of identity. Commerce had been a lifeline, and now it was severed. The destruction extended beyond shops and banks, reaching deep into private homes and possessions. Furniture, art, and heirlooms were seized under the guise of fines and taxes. Families who had once lived comfortably were reduced to begging for food or shelter. Even clothing and household goods were confiscated, leaving families with little more than the clothes they wore. Jewish professionals, lawyers, doctors, teachers were stripped of licenses, barred from practicing, and left destitute. A doctor who had once treated hundreds of patients was suddenly forbidden from entering a clinic. A lawyer who had defended cases in court found himself banned from speaking in public halls. Intellectual and professional life was dismantled alongside commerce. In the Nazi vision, Jews were to be left with no avenue of survival. It was not enough to persecute their faith, their means of existence had to vanish as well. In the aftermath, the psychological toll was as severe as the financial one. Families who had believed they could endure Nazi discrimination by clinging to their businesses now saw their last security vanish. A father, watching his shop transferred into the hands of a stranger, felt not only robbed but humiliated. Children saw their parents broken, stripped of authority, and reduced to pleading with officials. For many, Kristallnacht had been the moment of physical terror. The economic strangulation that followed was a slower, crushing despair. The knowledge that one's own country had orchestrated the theft made the pain all the more unbearable. The betrayal by neighbors who bought businesses or looted homes deepened the wound. Economics became another weapon in the arsenal of persecution, as deadly as bullets or fire. The destruction of wealth was also the destruction of hope. The Nazi propaganda machine cloaked the dispossession in false justification. Officials claimed that Jews had brought the punishment upon themselves, portraying them as parasites removed for the health of the nation. Newspapers echoed the narrative, assuring German citizens that Jewish wealth would now serve the Reich. Crowds who had cheered during Kristallnacht now lined up to buy discounted shops or goods. Many Germans benefited directly from the theft, often knowingly, while others chose not to ask questions. The regime presented the Aryanization of Jewish property as a patriotic duty, a cleansing of national life. In this way, the theft became normalized, woven into the everyday rhythms of German society. Ordinary people became complicit, not through violence, but through silent acceptance and economic gain. The destruction of Jewish life was thus embedded in the lives of their neighbors. For Jewish families, the sudden collapse of livelihood forced impossible choices. Many tried desperately to emigrate, selling what little remained to pay exit fees. Yet even this path was often blocked, as foreign nations closed their borders and the Reich demanded exorbitant sums for departure. Some families split apart, sending children abroad in the hope they might survive, while parents remained trapped. Others clung to the illusion that the storm would pass, that if they kept their heads down, life might return to normal. Yet Kristallnacht and the economic terror that followed had revealed a new reality. The state had demonstrated its intent, not merely to exclude Jews, but to annihilate their place in German society. Each fine, each confiscated shop, each stolen possession brought them closer to destitution. Poverty was not a byproduct, it was the policy itself. By the end of 1938, Jewish life in Germany had been economically strangled to the edge of survival. Shops once bustling with customers now stood shuttered under new names. Families who had been pillars of their communities were reduced to fugitives within their own homeland. Wealth, savings, and dignity had been stolen with a precision that mirrored the efficiency of the Nazi state. Kristallnacht was remembered as fire and glass, but its aftermath was silence and emptiness. Where once there had been shops, there were voids. Where once there had been professions, there was forced idleness. The Jews of Germany were now marked not only by religion, but by ruin. Economic destruction had achieved what violence alone could not: total dependency, total vulnerability, and total isolation. The Reich had made its intention clear. The road ahead would not lead to recovery, but to extermination. For Germany's Jews, Kristallnacht was not only a night of shattered glass and burned synagogues, it was the shattering of a fragile illusion of safety. For years, many had clung to the belief that persecution might remain limited to legal restrictions or social humiliation. That belief, however faint, allowed families to endure, to send children to school, to open shops in the morning, to attend synagogue with quiet dignity. On the night of November 9th, 1938, those hopes went up in flames alongside the sacred scrolls. In one brutal sweep, the line between discrimination and annihilation was crossed. The comfort of familiarity, neighbors, friends, even the state itself, was stripped away and replaced with terror. The very country they had fought for in World War I had turned violently against them. The betrayal reached not only their bodies and property, but the deepest corners of the soul. Kristallnacht left them with a terrifying realization: survival itself was no longer guaranteed. The psychological scars were immediate and profound. Children who had once walked streets with confidence now clung to their parents' hands in silence, terrified by the sight of broken windows and the echo of mobs. Parents, once the protectors, now felt powerless, unable to shield their families from the fury of the state. Stories spread quickly of fathers beaten in front of their children, of mothers dragged from their homes, of grandfathers humiliated before entire neighborhoods. Fear seeped into every Jewish household, not as a fleeting emotion but as a permanent state of being. Families whispered about whether to stay, whether to flee, whether to risk everything for uncertain exile. But with borders closing and nations unwilling to welcome them, options grew fewer by the day. The realization set in that Germany itself had become an enemy, merciless, unrelenting, and intent on their destruction. Spiritually, Kristallnacht struck at the core of Jewish life. The burning of synagogues was not merely an attack on buildings of brick and wood, it was the deliberate assault on the sacred heart of the community. Torah scrolls, carried for centuries through exile and survival, were reduced to ash in the streets. The chants of prayer were replaced by the crackle of fire and the mocking laughter of onlookers. For many Jews, this desecration felt like a desecration of history itself, as if centuries of endurance were being undone in a single night. Yet even in despair, some gathered quietly, praying in private homes, whispering ancient words of faith through tears. Others, devastated, questioned whether God had abandoned them, whether survival had any meaning in such a world. Kristallnacht forced a spiritual reckoning as deep as the physical destruction it left behind. The psychological impact extended beyond those who directly witnessed the violence. Letters, rumors, and photographs spread the horror across Jewish communities in Europe and beyond. Families in Berlin spoke to relatives in Munich, telling of shops reduced to rubble and men dragged to camps. The sense of insecurity was no longer confined to one city or one night. It was universal. Jewish parents put their children to bed with voices trembling, unsure of what dawn might bring. The rhythms of daily life, school, business, worship, were poisoned with fear. Each knock at the door could mean arrest. Each neighbor's glance could hide betrayal. Each street could erupt in violence once more. Kristallnacht planted the unshakable fear that this was only the beginning. It revealed with merciless clarity that Germany's Jews were no longer citizens, they were targets. Among older generations, Kristallnacht carried a unique cruelty. Many had believed that their loyalty to Germany, proven through decades of service and sacrifice, would shield them from the worst. Veterans of the First World War, medals on their chests, convinced that their blood spilled for the fatherland still carried meaning. Yet those medals meant nothing when mobs stormed their homes, when police arrested them alongside the rest, when synagogues built by their fathers went up in flames. For them, the betrayal was not only personal, it was generational. To have fought for Germany only to see it turn on them filled hearts with despair that words could scarcely capture. It was the collapse of a lifelong identity, a rupture that could never be repaired. Kristallnacht made clear that loyalty counted for nothing in the eyes of the Reich. For the younger generation, the destruction carried different lessons. Children and teenagers, who had grown up under Nazi propaganda and exclusion, suddenly saw their future vanish overnight. No longer could they dream of careers, universities, or professional lives in their homeland. Schools barred them, teachers mocked them, and classmates joined in jeers or violence. Many young people began to dream not of life in Germany, but of escape, imagining distant lands where survival might be possible. Some, filled with anger, whispered of resistance, though such talk was dangerous and rare. Others simply fell silent, burdened with fear too great for their years. Kristallnacht imprinted itself on their memories as the night childhood ended. It was the moment innocence was irreversibly replaced by survival instinct. The spiritual rupture was also collective, reverberating across entire communities. Before Kristallnacht, Jews had endured humiliation, but many still believed in some form of coexistence, however diminished. After Kristallnacht, that belief lay in ruins. Entire neighborhoods mourned not just for their dead and imprisoned, but for the death of hope itself. Families gathered in candle-lit rooms, whispering prayers, not of confidence but of desperation. Rabbis spoke of resilience, yet even their voices cracked with grief at the sight of sacred scrolls trampled underfoot. Communities that had stood for centuries now felt rootless, suspended between annihilation and exile. What had once been a society integrated, however unequally, into German life, was now pushed entirely to the margins. Kristallnacht taught them they no longer belonged. In the weeks that followed, the psychological and spiritual damage continued to deepen. Fear became a constant companion, altering every decision, every word, every glance. Families no longer discussed whether life would improve. They asked only how much worse it would become. Faith, once a source of strength, became a battleground between despair and determination. For some, the destruction of synagogues severed their bond with God. For others, it made that bond stronger, clinging to faith as the only thing the Nazis could not steal. But all Jews in Germany shared the same realization. Kristallnacht was not the end of persecution. It was the beginning of something darker. The night of broken glass had shattered not only windows but illusions. What remained was fear, despair, and the haunting certainty that annihilation was no longer unthinkable. It was looming. Kristallnacht did not emerge as a single eruption of violence. It signaled a profound transformation in Nazi policy. Until November 1938, persecution had largely taken the form of laws, segregation, propaganda, and the stripping away of rights, cruel yet measured within a legal framework. But the night of broken glass broke down those boundaries, unleashing the machinery of physical terror on a scale sanctioned by the state. What had once been discrimination became outright violence, orchestrated with military precision under the guise of spontaneous outrage. Synagogues burned under the watch of uniformed officers, men were beaten in the open streets, and thousands were sent to camps with no trial. It was a watershed moment, a transition from repression to annihilation. For Jews across Germany and Austria, the message was brutally clear. The state no longer wanted to isolate them, it wanted to destroy them. From this point forward, survival meant escaping a nation determined to erase them. In the minds of the Nazi leadership, Kristallnacht was more than a pogrom. It was a test. Could the German public stomach the sight of shattered Jewish lives in their streets? Could the international community be counted on to do nothing but protest from a distance? The answer to both questions emboldened Hitler and his inner circle. German society proved pliant, many even approving of what they witnessed, while others turned away in silence. Foreign governments issued condemnations, yet few opened their doors to Jewish refugees or imposed meaningful consequences on the Reich. This lack of decisive response told the Nazis that they could escalate further without fear of intervention. The lesson was chilling. Violence against Jews could move from the margins of society into the open heart of public life. Kristallnacht revealed that mass violence could be staged, justified, and absorbed into everyday existence. For Jews within the Reich, Kristallnacht was a cruel prophecy of what lay ahead. Families who had endured humiliation and restrictions with a stubborn will to remain in Germany now recognized that the state intended something far worse. The arrests of over 30,000 men, many of whom were sent to Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen, introduced Jews to the growing shadow of the concentration camp system. What had been presented as labor camps or re-education centers revealed themselves as instruments of terror, capable of swallowing entire communities. The brutality of guards, the conditions of imprisonment, and the humiliation of release left no doubt that camps would serve as laboratories for the coming Holocaust. Kristallnacht showed Jews that the Reich was no longer satisfied with control. It now sought to annihilate their presence altogether. The event also marked a turning point in Nazi strategy. For years, the regime had experimented with policies aimed at forcing Jews to emigrate, hoping to make the Reich Judenfrei through pressure and humiliation. Yet Kristallnacht revealed the limitations of emigration, as the world's refusal to absorb large numbers of Jewish refugees left them trapped inside the Reich. This failure of escape sealed their fate. Nazi leaders began to shift their vision, understanding that if Jews could not be expelled en masse, then they would have to be eliminated by other means. The pogrom became the hinge between two phases of Nazi persecution, one of displacement and one of destruction. Though death camps still lay in the future, the psychological groundwork was laid on that November night. On a deeper level, Kristallnacht changed the social contract between Jews and their neighbors. Before, Jews could cling to the hope that persecution was the work of a radical fringe within Germany's leadership. After the pogrom, it became undeniable that the violence was sanctioned by the full weight of the state. Ordinary citizens watched fires burn. Some joined the looting, others pretended not to see. The realization set in that society itself had been weaponized against them, erasing the final remnants of belonging. For Jewish children walking to school past charred synagogues, or for businessmen finding their shops reduced to rubble, there was no longer any doubt Germany had declared war on their existence. The psychological terror was as decisive as the physical violence, preparing the population for what would come next. Kristallnacht also played a vital role in shaping Nazi propaganda and its future campaigns. Joseph Goebbels seized on the pogrom to portray Jews as enemies of the state, using von Rath's assassination as the supposed justification for righteous anger. The narrative carefully inverted reality, casting perpetrators as defenders and victims as conspirators. This manipulation of public perception turned mass violence into a patriotic act, normalizing brutality under the guise of protecting the nation. From this moment forward, propaganda would not only vilify Jews, but also desensitize the public to their annihilation. The blending of lies, fear, and spectacle ensured that when ghettos were built, when trains rolled east, and when extermination camps began their work, the majority of Germans would accept or ignore what was unfolding. For historians, Kristallnacht stands as a line drawn across history. It was no longer possible to describe Nazi anti-Jewish policy as a process of incremental repression. The state had demonstrated its willingness to mobilize violence on a national scale, to destroy lives in public view, and to treat Jewish existence as expendable. Survivors of that night later described it as the moment hope died, when the possibility of coexistence collapsed forever. The shattered glass symbolized not only broken windows, but broken illusions, broken communities, and broken futures. From then on, Jews within the Reich lived not as citizens under siege, but as targets awaiting the next assault. The trajectory was set, and the Holocaust moved from a possibility to a looming inevitability. In the memory of the Holocaust, Kristallnacht endures as its prologue, the moment when ideology crossed into action, when words of hatred became deeds of terror. It was the beginning of genocide, though few could yet see the full magnitude of what was coming. Families mourning burned synagogues, and lost fathers could not imagine the scale of mass graves or the smoke of extermination camps. Yet in hindsight, the pattern is clear. Kristallnacht was the rehearsal, the warning, the threshold into the abyss. The world would remember it not just as a pogrom, but as the signal fire of the Holocaust, the night when Germany's Jews were told their future would be one of destruction. It is remembered as the moment when terror ceased to be sporadic and became systematic, the overture to humanity's darkest chapter. The memory of Kristallnacht is perhaps best preserved not in government reports or photographs, but in the trembling voices of those who lived through it. Survivors recall the sound of shattering glass, a chorus that echoed through entire neighborhoods as if the very heart of their communities was being ripped apart. Many described waking in the dead of night to the pounding of fists on their doors, the shouting of mobs, and the glare of fires lighting up the sky. For children, it was a night of terror that reshaped their understanding of the world, teaching them in one violent moment that they were no longer safe in their own homes. Parents tried desperately to shield them, whispering reassurances even as their own hearts raced with fear. Shopkeepers returned the next morning to find their livelihoods reduced to rubble, their family names painted in hatred across smashed walls. For rabbis and congregants, seeing centuries-old scrolls and sanctuaries burned was like watching their ancestors vanish in smoke. Every survivor's testimony becomes a mosaic of grief, each fragment illuminating a night that seemed endless. Some testimonies dwell on the paralyzing helplessness of the experience. Families huddled together, peering through curtains as stormtroopers and civilians smashed their possessions with glee. Many spoke of the eerie silence of neighbors who did nothing, their faces turned away as if the suffering outside their windows did not exist. One elderly survivor remembered clinging to her prayer book as her synagogue burned, its flames reflecting in her tear-filled eyes. Another recalled being dragged from his home, beaten in the street, and marched away as his children screamed, powerless to intervene. The sense of betrayal by a society they once considered their own cut as deep as the blows of fists and boots. The realization that the law no longer protected them was a wound that never healed. Their voices remind us that Kristallnacht was not only destruction of property, but the collapse of trust in humanity itself. Children's accounts are among the most haunting, their memories shaped by both confusion and terror. A boy recalled clutching his mother's skirt as glass rained down around them, the sound so sharp it seemed to pierce the night air like bullets. Another remembered being dragged out of bed, barefoot and shivering, forced to stand in the cold as his father was taken away by uniformed men. For many, the image of burning synagogues seared itself into their young minds, a sight that no passage of time could erase. Some children were too young to understand the politics of hate, but old enough to feel the weight of fear pressing down on their families. These experiences marked them for life, often leading to exile, statelessness, or survival in hiding. Their words remind us that innocence was not spared in the storm, that even the smallest shoulders carried the weight of an entire people's suffering. Testimonies from women reveal another dimension of trauma, the burden of holding families together in the face of chaos. Mothers described desperately gathering their children, whispering prayers, and trying to prepare for an unknown future with only the clothes on their backs. Wives stood outside prisons and police stations, pleading for news of their husbands, dragged away in the night. Daughters remembered watching their fathers humiliated in public, forced to scrub streets while jeering crowds looked on. Some women recounted the despair of losing brothers and uncles to concentration camps, their absence felt in every empty chair at the dinner table. Others recalled neighbors who had once shared meals, now spitting insults or standing by with folded arms. For women, the scars of Kristallnacht were measured not only in shattered glass, but in broken families, and the weight of survival left squarely upon them. For men, the pogrom often meant direct violence and imprisonment. Survivors spoke of being beaten with rifle butts, dragged from their homes, and transported in crowded trucks to waiting camps. Many recalled the humiliation of being paraded through the streets, bloodied and bruised in front of their children and wives. Inside Dachau, Buchenwald, or Sachsenhausen, the experience was seared into memory, the barked orders, the overcrowded barracks, the brutality of guards eager to break their spirits. Some men never returned, while others emerged weakened and scarred, both physically and mentally. Those who survived often described Kristallnacht as the moment they realized the Nazi state sought not only to humiliate them, but to annihilate them entirely. Their stories echo with the rawness of violence endured and the resilience it took to survive. The psychological aftermath of Kristallnacht emerges strongly in survivor accounts. Many described nightmares that lingered for decades, the sounds of smashing glass and screams haunting them in their sleep. Others recalled the crushing weight of fear that lingered long after the fires were extinguished, the knowledge that life could never return to what it had been. Some spoke of the silence of neighbors and the betrayal of friends, wounds as deep as physical blows. The destruction of synagogues was not merely an attack on buildings, but on identity itself, leaving survivors adrift without the spiritual anchors of their communities. This trauma did not fade with time, but carried across generations, shaping the lives of children and grandchildren who inherited the memories. Survivor testimonies become bridges between past and present, warning that such hatred cannot be forgotten. Yet within these accounts, glimmers of resilience also appear. Some survivors remembered small acts of kindness, a neighbor who whispered a warning, or a stranger who opened a back door to let them escape. Others recalled the determination to preserve memory, to pass down the stories so that their suffering would not vanish into silence. Families who fled Germany carried with them not only scars, but also the will to rebuild, often in new countries, where they struggled to create new lives. Their resilience, however, was never untouched by the trauma of that night, which shaped their identities and haunted their hearts. The very act of surviving, of speaking decades later, became an act of defiance against those who sought their erasure. Survivor testimonies, therefore, are not only stories of loss, but of the persistence of human dignity. In the end, the voices of survivors transform Kristallnacht from history into lived experience. Their stories ensure that the pogrom is remembered not as an abstract tragedy, but as a night of human suffering felt in shattered families and scarred hearts. Each testimony is a fragment of truth, piecing together a narrative of horror and resilience. Without their words, Kristallnacht risks becoming numbers and statistics. With them, it remains a living wound that continues to resonate. Their memories remind us that hatred, once unleashed, spreads like fire, consuming not only its targets, but the conscience of entire societies. By speaking, they preserve not only the past, but the warning it carries for the future. Their voices echo across time, urging us never to forget the night when glass shattered, synagogues burned, and the world trembled at the beginning of the Holocaust. The memory of Kristallnacht lingers as one of history's darkest warnings, a night when violence moved from the shadows of discrimination into the open streets of terror. Today, its shattered glass is remembered not only as the debris of synagogues and storefronts, but as fragments of human trust broken beyond repair. Across Europe and the wider world, memorials and museums mark the night with solemnity, ensuring that new generations understand its meaning. Survivors' voices are woven into this memory, their testimonies carried into classrooms, archives, and ceremonies. The night has become a touchstone for understanding how quickly hatred can become policy, and how swiftly policy can become violence. Each November, vigils with candles recall the flames of burning synagogues, offering light where once there was only destruction. Memory becomes a form of resistance, a refusal to let silence complete the work of the perpetrators. In this way, Kristallnacht survives not as a relic of history, but as a living cautionary tale. For Jewish communities worldwide, Kristallnacht is remembered with both mourning and resilience. It marks the point at which many realized that life in Germany was no longer sustainable, and that survival might mean exile. Families tell stories of that night as part of their heritage, a reminder of why their journeys led them to new homelands. Synagogues destroyed are often rebuilt in memory, standing as symbols of perseverance against all odds. Commemorative plaques in German cities mark the sites where Torah scrolls once burned, or where businesses were smashed, transforming places of horror into sites of reflection. In remembering, Jewish communities connect their past suffering to the broader story of endurance and continuity. These acts of commemoration honor those lost while affirming the survival of Jewish life, despite every attempt to extinguish it. For Germans, Kristallnacht remains a wound in national memory, one that demands acknowledgement and responsibility. Schools across the country dedicate lessons to its history, and government officials participate in remembrance ceremonies. Streets once filled with hate-fueled mobs are now often lined with memorials or stumbling stones, brass plaques embedded in the pavement with the names of victims. This act of public remembrance forces confrontation with the past, ensuring that denial cannot take root where truth is literally beneath one's feet. At the same time, the memory remains uncomfortable, a reminder of complicity and silence. For many in Germany, remembering Kristallnacht is an act of atonement, a solemn vow that such violence must never again find a place within their borders. In this way, the legacy of the pogrom becomes both a burden and a promise. Globally, Kristallnacht has become a symbol of the consequences of unchecked hatred. It is cited in discussions about genocide, racism, and intolerance in many forms. Governments and organizations around the world mark its anniversary not only as a remembrance of Jewish suffering, but as a universal lesson. Its story is used to teach about the dangers of indifference and the moral cost of looking away. In countries far removed from Germany, Kristallnacht resonates because its lessons transcend borders and time. The shattered glass and burning synagogues become symbols that warn against every form of persecution that begins with words and ends with violence. In this way, the pogrom's legacy extends far beyond Europe, echoing as a lesson for all humanity. The spiritual legacy of Kristallnacht is carried in the silence it left behind, but also in the prayers and songs that rose from ashes. Communities rebuild their faith as a form of defiance, carrying on traditions that were nearly extinguished. The destruction of synagogues, once intended to erase identity, has instead reinforced the determination to preserve it. Survivors pass down stories not only of loss, but of perseverance, embedding resilience in the next generations. For many, lighting Sabbath candles became a quiet act of remembrance, a way to honor those who could no longer do so. The legacy of faith after Kristallnacht shows that while buildings can be burned, spirit cannot be so easily destroyed. This resilience stands as part of the night's enduring memory. The psychological legacy of Kristallnacht is equally profound, shaping survivors and their descendants for decades. Many who lived through it carried nightmares that never left them, a constant reminder of fragility and loss. Families often spoke of Kristallnacht as the moment when innocence was broken and the world revealed its cruelty. Children who witnessed it grew into adults, marked by trauma, their outlook on humanity forever altered for descendants. The stories became a heavy inheritance, a responsibility to carry forward memory. In this way, the legacy of Kristallnacht is not just historical, but deeply personal, etched into family identities across continents. The pain endures, but so does the will to speak truth against silence. In the larger history of the Holocaust, Kristallnacht stands as the unmistakable turning point from discrimination to destruction. It was no longer about laws or segregation, but about open violence sanctioned by the state. In hindsight, it is seen as the warning that the world failed to heed, the signal that the path to genocide had begun. Its legacy is thus a constant reminder that such warnings must never again be ignored. Historians, educators, and activists draw upon Kristallnacht to illustrate how societies slide into atrocity when propaganda, prejudice, and political power converge. Remembering the pogrom is a way of ensuring that the chain of events leading to mass violence can be recognized before it is too late. Ultimately, the legacy of Kristallnacht lies in its duality, a night of destruction that has become a beacon of remembrance. It embodies both the fragility of civilization and the resilience of memory. Across the world, it is invoked as a moral compass, urging vigilance against hatred in all its forms. Its shattered glass echoes in every warning about intolerance, and its fires burn in the candles of remembrance lit each year. For survivors and their descendants, it is a scar, but also a testament to endurance. For the world, it is a lesson etched in tragedy, one that demands not only memory, but action. In this way, Kristallnacht remains alive in history, a night of terror transformed into a lasting symbol of resistance against the dangers of hatred left unchecked.